The stagecoach door swung open, and Ethan Cole's world changed forever. He'd expected a bride. What arrived was a ghost. Lillian Moore descended those wooden steps like a woman walking to her execution, one eye swollen shut, purple bruises mapping her pale cheekbone like territories of pain. In her trembling hand, a crumpled note. She needs sanctuary, not questions. Her past is hunting her. The Montana wind caught her torn sleeve, revealing more bruises underneath. Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd lived alone for 8 years, preferring silence to complications. But seeing this broken woman, something ancient and protective roared to life inside him. If you want to see how a cowboy's promise can transform two broken souls into something unbreakable, stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The dust hadn't even settled from the stagecoach wheels when Ethan Cole realized his carefully ordered life was about to shatter into 1,000 complicated pieces. He stood at the edge of Benton's Crossing, Montana territory, his worn leather hat pulled low against the September sun, watching the Concord coach rumble toward the station with a sense of dread he couldn't quite name. 3 months ago, in a moment of whiskey-soaked loneliness, he'd written to the Boston marriage agency. 3 months ago, he'd been desperate enough to believe a mail-order bride might fill the silence that had become his constant companion on his remote homestead. Now, watching that coach door swing open, Ethan wondered if desperation had made him a fool. The first thing he saw was her hand, small, pale, gripping the doorframe with such force her knuckles had gone white. Then came her shoe, a worn leather boot that had seen better days, finding purchase on the coach step. Finally, the woman herself emerged into the harsh Montana sunlight, and Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat for all the wrong reasons. She was young, maybe 22, 23 at most. Her dark hair, once probably arranged in some fashionable Boston style, hung in disheveled waves around a face that told a story Ethan had seen too many times before. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut, the skin around it a vicious palette of purples and yellows. A cut across her cheekbone had scabbed over, and when she turned her head slightly, he caught sight of bruising along her jaw that disappeared beneath the high collar of her traveling dress. But it was her eyes, that one good eye that could still open fully, that struck him hardest. It wasn't fear he saw there, not exactly. It was something far more dangerous, the flat, hollow look of someone who'd stopped expecting kindness from the world. "Mr. Cole?" The station manager, Harold Benson, approached with an uncomfortable expression and an envelope in his hand. "This came with the young lady, from the agency. They said you'd need to read it before anything else." Ethan took the envelope, his eyes never leaving the woman who now stood beside the coach, one small carpet bag at her feet, looking like she might bolt if anyone moved too quickly. He tore open the seal and read, "Mr. Cole, Miss Lillian Moore is not the bride we intended to send. Her file was prepared in haste due to extraordinary circumstances. She has fled Boston under duress, escaping a situation that posed immediate danger to her well-being. We felt her need for sanctuary outweighed all other considerations. She has no other options. Her passage was paid by concerned parties who wish to remain anonymous. She carries no dowry, no prospects, and considerable trauma. If you cannot or will not honor the arrangement, we ask only that you ensure her safe passage to whatever destination she chooses. She is not damaged goods, Mr. Cole. She is a woman who had the courage to run when running was her only choice. We pray you are the man of honor your letters suggested. With urgent hope, Mrs. Catherine Hensworth, Boston Marriage Agency." Ethan folded the letter slowly, his mind racing through implications and obligations and something else he couldn't quite name. He'd wanted a wife, someone to share the burden of his isolated existence, perhaps eventually to build something resembling a family. He'd imagined someone practical, someone who understood the harsh realities of frontier life. He hadn't imagined this. "Mr. Cole!" A voice, soft and cultured despite its tremor, made him look up. Lillian Moore had approached while he read, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body hurt. Up close, the damage was even more evident. Fingerprint bruises on her wrists, a slight limp favoring her left side. The way she held herself suggested broken ribs healing poorly. I understand this is not what you expected. The agency, they arranged my passage without full disclosure. If you wish to refuse the arrangement, I will understand completely." Her voice carried the educated tones of Boston society, each word precisely articulated despite their trembling quality. She spoke like someone accustomed to holding herself together through force of will alone. "I'm not refusing anything," Ethan heard himself say, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "I'm Ethan Cole. I own a homestead about 8 miles north of here. It's remote, it's rough, and it's not what you're probably used to. But it's safe, and that seems like what you need most right now." Something flickered in that one good eye, surprise maybe, or disbelief that anyone would offer kindness without immediate expectation of something in return. "I can work," she said quickly. "I'm educated. I can read and write, keep accounts. I know some cooking, though perhaps not the kind suited to—" She gestured vaguely at the raw frontier town around them. "I will earn my keep, Mr. Cole. I won't be a burden." "Didn't say you would be." Ethan picked up her single carpet bag, surprised by how light it was. Everything she owned in the world, apparently, weighed less than a sack of flour. "You hungry?" Yes. The journey was long. There's a restaurant of sorts, nothing fancy. We'll get some food in you, pick up supplies, then head to the homestead before dark. Weather's turning, and I don't want to be caught on the trail after sunset." As they walked toward the town's main street, really just a collection of rough buildings clustered around the stagecoach route, Ethan was acutely aware of the stairs following them. Benton's Crossing was small enough that everyone noticed everything, and a battered woman arriving as a mail-order bride would fuel gossip for months. Let them stare. He'd never given a damn about town opinion before. He wasn't about to start now. The restaurant was actually just the front room of Martha Henderson's boarding house, where she served meals to anyone willing to pay 50 cents for whatever she'd cooked that day. The smell of beef stew and fresh bread hit them as they entered, and Ethan saw Lillian's expression shift slightly, hunger winning out over everything else for just a moment. "Ethan Cole." Martha emerged from her kitchen, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. She was a widow in her 50s, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, who'd run this place since her husband died in a mining accident 7 years back. Her gaze moved from Ethan to Lillian, and he saw the exact moment she registered the bruises. Her expression hardened. "This would be your bride from Boston?" "This is Miss Lillian Moore," Ethan said carefully. "We'd appreciate 2 bowls of whatever you're serving, and maybe some of that bread." Martha's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. "Sit wherever. I'll bring it out." They settled at a corner table, Lillian moving gingerly as she lowered herself into the chair. Ethan watched her trying to hide the pain, and something in his chest tightened with an anger he had no right to feel. "The letter mentioned you were running from something," he said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to Martha's kitchen. "You don't have to tell me details if you don't want to, but I should know if someone's likely to come looking for you." Lillian's good eye fixed on the rough wooden table. For a long moment she said nothing, and Ethan thought maybe he'd pushed too hard, too fast. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My uncle, Richard Moore. He's a prominent attorney in Boston, wealthy, well-connected, respected." The way she said respected carried layers of bitter irony. "My parents died when I was 15, yellow fever. My uncle became my guardian, which gave him control of my inheritance until I married or turned 25. "He did that to you?" Ethan kept his voice level, but his hands clenched under the table. "Not directly. He would never risk marking his own hands." Lillian's jaw tightened. "He had associates, men he employed to remind me that he controlled every aspect of my life. When I refused his choice of husband, a business partner of his, 40 years old and cruel, the reminders became more physical." Martha arrived with 2 steaming bowls of stew and a basket of bread, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes full of questions she was too polite to ask. When she left, Lillian continued, her words coming faster now, as if speaking them aloud was breaking some internal dam. "3 weeks ago, I overheard my uncle discussing the wedding date with his partner. They spoke about my inheritance as if I were already dead, how they would divide it, what investments they would make. And I realized that if I married this man, I probably wouldn't survive the first year. It would be made to look like an accident, and my uncle would express appropriate grief while spending my parents' money. She picked up her spoon with a hand that trembled slightly. I had a maid named Clara who'd been kind to me. She had a cousin who worked at the marriage agency. Between them, they arranged everything, forged letters of recommendation, paid my passage, even gave me this dress since I couldn't leave with anything that might be traced. She touched the fabric of her traveling dress, worn but serviceable. I left with nothing but the clothes Clara gave me and my mother's locket. Her hand went to her throat, where Ethan now noticed a delicate gold chain disappearing beneath her collar. "Does he know where you went?" "I don't think so. Clara told him I'd run off with a merchant sailor heading to New York. But my uncle is persistent and has resources. Eventually, he may think to check marriage agencies. When he does..." She finally met Ethan's eyes, and he saw the fear she'd been trying to hide. "I'm sorry. You asked for a wife, and instead you've inherited someone else's problem." "You're not a problem." The words came out harder than Ethan intended, and Lillian flinched slightly. He softened his tone. "You're a person who got dealt a rotten hand. That's not the same thing." She studied him with an expression he couldn't quite read, surprise and suspicion, and something that might have been the faintest glimmer of hope. "The agency letter mentioned you were expecting something different," she said. "Someone who could actually be a proper wife." "I should be honest with you, Mr. Cole. I have no experience running a frontier household. I was raised in Boston society. Useless skills like watercolors and French conversation. I can't shoot, I've never milked a cow, and I faint at the sight of blood. You'd be within your rights to put me back on that stagecoach." "Where would you go?" The question hung between them. They both knew the answer. Nowhere. She had no money, no connections, no safety anywhere else. "Then perhaps," Lillian said carefully, "we should discuss the terms of our arrangement. The agency contract specifies marriage within 3 months of arrival, but given the circumstances, if you prefer a different arrangement, employment as a housekeeper perhaps, or..." "Let's get one thing straight." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "I don't know what kind of men you've dealt with in Boston, but out here a man's word means something. I wrote to that agency asking for a wife because I wanted a partner, not a servant and not a victim I could take advantage of. You want to get married in 3 months? We'll get married. You want to wait longer? We'll wait. You decide you want nothing to do with marriage at all. That's your choice to make." He sat back, aware that he'd probably said too much, revealed too much of the anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. Anger at her uncle, at whoever had put those bruises on her face, at a world that treated women like property to be traded and used. "What I'm offering," he continued more calmly, "is time. Time to heal, time to figure out what you want, time to decide if this life out here is something you can tolerate. The homestead is 8 miles from the nearest neighbor. It's isolated, it's quiet, and it's yours if you want it. No expectations, no obligations, except to get yourself healthy again." Lillian stared at him like he'd started speaking a foreign language. "Shit. You're serious. I don't joke much. But the contract is paper. What matters is what we decide between us." He pushed his barely touched stew toward her, noticing she'd already finished hers. "Eat. You look like you haven't had a decent meal in weeks." "I haven't." She said it simply, reaching for the second bowl without false modesty. My uncle believed hunger was a useful tool for ensuring compliance. The casual way she said it, as if starving a young woman was merely a practical strategy, made Ethan want to find Richard Moore and introduce him to the business end of his fists. Instead, he signaled Martha for more bread. They ate in silence for a few minutes, Lillian attacking the food with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned not to take meals for granted. When she finally slowed down, some color had returned to her pale cheeks. "I should tell you," she said, breaking a piece of bread with careful precision, "I'm not a coward. I know running away might seem like weakness, but staying would have been death. I chose life, Mr. Cole, even if it meant fleeing to the unknown." "Takes more courage to run than to stay and let yourself be destroyed," Ethan said. "Anyone who says different is a fool. My uncle would say a proper lady accepts her circumstances with grace." "Your uncle sounds like someone who's never had circumstances forced on him." Ethan stood, leaving coins on the table for Martha. "We should get supplies before the general store closes, unless you need more time to rest." "I've rested enough." Lillian rose, moving more easily now that food had given her strength. I'd rather keep moving. The general store was owned by Samuel Tucker, a transplant from Ohio who'd come west for gold and stayed to sell supplies to other disappointed prospectors. He looked up from his ledger as they entered, his expression shifting from commercial welcome to poorly concealed curiosity. Ethan, heard your bride arrived on the afternoon coach. News travels fast. Ethan handed him a list he'd prepared weeks ago. Flour, coffee, sugar, salt, dried beans, ammunition. Basic supplies to get them through the coming winter. Small town. Samuel's eyes kept drifting to Lillian, who'd moved to examine a display of fabric bolts with studied fascination. Everything all right? Fine. Ethan's tone didn't invite further questions. Samuel got the message and started gathering items from the list. While he worked, Ethan noticed Lillian had paused at a shelf of books, a meager collection Samuel kept mostly for show, since literacy wasn't exactly common among the prospectors and cowboys who made up his clientele. You read? Ethan asked, coming up beside her. Voraciously. She touched the spine of a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets with something like hunger. It was one of the few things my uncle couldn't take from me, though he tried. He felt education made women difficult. Imagine that. Ethan pulled the book from the shelf and added it to his growing pile of supplies. We've got a few books at the homestead. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep you occupied during the winter. You don't have to. I want to. He met her eyes steadily. Consider it a welcome gift. Her expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to name, finally settling on something that might have been gratitude mixed with suspicion, as if she couldn't quite believe in gifts that came without hidden prices. Samuel finished loading supplies into 2 large crates. I'll have my boy help you load these into your wagon. Appreciate it. Ethan paid, watching the coins disappear with the knowledge that his carefully saved funds had just taken a significant hit. Worth it, though, to see the way Lillian held that book of sonnets like it was made of gold. The wagon was where he'd left it, his sturdy mare Bess still hitched and waiting patiently. Samuel's son, a gangly teenager named Jimmy, helped load the crates while casting curious glances at Lillian. Miss? Jimmy finally worked up the courage to speak directly to her. Welcome to Montana territory. I hope you'll be happy here. Thank you. Lillian's smile was small but genuine. That's very kind. The boy practically glowed, and Ethan felt something unexpected, a flash of possessive pride that he had no right to feel. This wasn't really his wife, not yet, maybe not ever. They'd known each other for less than 2 hours, but watching her smile at that awkward boy, seeing her try to find grace despite her obvious pain and fear, Ethan realized something fundamental had shifted. He'd asked for a wife out of loneliness and practicality. What had arrived was something far more complicated and infinitely more valuable, a person who needed him to be better than he'd ever been before. We should go, he said, offering his hand to help her into the wagon. Storm's coming. Lillian looked at the sky, which had indeed begun to darken with the kind of clouds that meant serious weather. She accepted his hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her injuries, and climbed onto the wagon seat with careful determination. Ethan settled beside her, taking up the reins. The ride's rough. About 8 miles of prairie trail. If you need to stop at any point, I'll manage. She wrapped her shawl tighter against the rising wind. I've managed worse. He believed her. They left Benton's Crossing behind, the small cluster of buildings disappearing as the wagon rolled north across open prairie. The land here was vast and unforgiving, rolling grasslands that stretched to distant mountains, interrupted only by occasional stands of cottonwood marking hidden creeks. The sky overhead seemed impossibly huge, and Ethan watched Lillian's expression as she took in the sheer scale of the territory. It's so empty, she whispered. Gets lonely, he admitted, especially in winter. Nearest neighbor is Thomas Whitmore, about 4 miles east. Good man, keeps to himself mostly. The Hendersons have a ranch 6 miles south. They're the ones with 5 kids always getting into trouble. Beyond that, it's just space. How long have you been here? 8 years. Came in 75, right after... He stopped, unsure how much to share. Right after some things ended that needed ending, figured Montana was far enough from everything else. Running from something too? She said it without judgment, just simple understanding. Something like that. He guided Bess around a rough patch of ground. Built the homestead from nothing. It's not much, but it's solid. One bedroom, main room with a fireplace, small kitchen. Built a barn 2 years ago for the animals. Got 4 horses, a milk cow, some chickens. Enough to get by. And you've been alone all this time? Preferred it that way, or thought I did. He glanced at her. Turns out solitude and loneliness aren't the same thing. Took me a while to figure that out. They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and the wind moving through the grass. Dark clouds were rolling in faster now, and Ethan urged Bess to pick up the pace. Can I ask you something? Lillian's voice was quiet, almost lost in the wind. Sure. Why did you agree to this? A mail-order bride arrangement seems... She struggled for words. It seems like it would attract a certain kind of man. Men looking for cheap labor, or worse. You don't seem like that kind of man. Ethan thought about how to answer that. I was a scout during the war, saw enough violence to last a lifetime. When it ended, I wanted quiet. Came out here. Built something with my own hands, lived on my own terms. But after 8 years, the quiet started feeling more like emptiness. Thought maybe having someone to share it with would make a difference. That's not really an answer, and he huffed out something that might have been a laugh. No, I suppose it's not. Truth is, I'm 34 years old, Miss Moore. I'm rough around the edges, I'm not much for conversation, and I live in the middle of nowhere. Not exactly prime marriage material for women who have choices. Mail order arrangement seemed like the only option for someone like me. You're being too hard on yourself. Am I? He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. I'm telling you straight, life out here is harsh. Winters are brutal, summers are scorching, and sometimes days go by without seeing another soul. The work never stops. Animals need tending, fences need fixing, crops need planting and harvesting. It's not the life you were raised for. The life I was raised for was a gilded cage. Lillian's voice carried an edge of steel beneath its cultured tones. At least out here, if I'm trapped, it's by circumstances I chose rather than ones forced upon me. You consider this trapped? I don't know yet. She turned to look at him directly. Ask me again in a few months. Fair enough. The first drops of rain hit as they crested a low rise, and suddenly Ethan could see his homestead in the distance. A squat cabin with a stone chimney, the barn beside it, everything looking small and vulnerable against the vast landscape. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney if he'd banked the fire properly that morning. The sight of it, his home, solid and waiting, brought an unexpected feeling of relief. There, he said, pointing. That's it. Lillian leaned forward, studying the distant buildings. Whatever she thought of what she saw, she kept to herself. The rain started in earnest as they pulled into the yard, heavy drops that promised to turn into a serious storm. Ethan brought the wagon as close to the cabin door as possible. Go inside, he told Lillian. Get dry. I need to unhitch Bess and get her into the barn. I can help. You can barely walk. He said it without cruelty, just stating fact. Get inside, get warm. There's a fire that needs stoking. I'll be in as soon as the animals are settled. For a moment, he thought she might argue, but then she nodded and climbed down from the wagon, moving carefully across the muddy yard to the cabin door. She paused on the threshold, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't read in the dimming light, then disappeared inside. Ethan worked quickly, unhitching Bess and getting her into the barn along with the other horses. The cow, Bessie, he'd never been creative with names, was already in her stall, contentedly chewing hay. The chickens had taken themselves to roost. Everything secure, he grabbed the supply crates and made a run for the cabin through the now pouring rain. Inside, Lillian had managed to coax the banked fire back to life. She stood in front of it, still wearing her damp traveling dress, looking around the cabin's single main room with wide eyes. It wasn't much. Ethan saw it suddenly through her eyes and felt a stab of inadequacy. Rough log walls, a table he'd built himself that sat slightly uneven, 2 mismatched chairs, a trunk that held his spare clothes, a shelf with a few books and supplies. The bedroom door stood open, revealing his narrow bed with its plain blankets. Everything was clean and functional, but there was no decoration, no softness, no sign that anything but survival mattered here. It's not, he started. It's wonderful, Lillian interrupted, surprising him. She turned from the fire, her good eye bright with something that might have been relief. It's warm and dry, and it's yours. No one can walk through that door without permission. No one can hurt. Her voice caught. I'm sorry. It's just been so long since I felt safe anywhere. Ethan set down the crates, suddenly aware of how small the space was, how close they were standing, how alone they were out here with miles of empty prairie in every direction. The situation's intimacy hit him like a physical blow. This woman, this stranger, was now in his home with no one to protect her but him. The bedroom is yours, he said gruffly. I'll sleep out here by the fire. There are extra blankets in the trunk if you need them. Water basin is there for washing. It's not fancy. Stop apologizing. Lillian's voice was firm despite its exhaustion. This is more than I hoped for, more than I deserve. You deserve a hell of a lot more than running from a man who should have protected you. The anger was back in his voice, and he saw her take an instinctive step back. He forced himself to calm down. Sorry, I shouldn't. It's not my place to. You're angry on my behalf. She said it with wonder, as if the concept was foreign. No one's been angry on my behalf before. Then you've known the wrong people. A crack of thunder made them both jump. The storm was directly overhead now, rain hammering on the roof with impressive force. Lillian wrapped her arms around herself, and Ethan noticed she was shivering. You need to get out of those wet clothes, he said, then immediately felt his face heat at the implication. I mean, there's some clothes in the trunk, old shirts, spare pants. They'll be too big, but they're dry and warm for sleeping, to sleep in. He was making this worse, definitely making this worse. A sound made him look up. Lillian was laughing, actually laughing, one hand pressed to her mouth as if she couldn't quite believe the sound was coming from her. I'm sorry, she gasped. It's not funny. You're being so kind and it's just... Another laugh escaped. You're so flustered and it's the first normal thing that's happened to me in months. Ethan felt his own mouth twitch with something that might have been a smile. Glad my discomfort is entertaining. It's refreshing. She wiped at her eyes, and he realized with a start that she was crying even as she laughed. My uncle's associates were never flustered. They knew exactly what they were doing, every calculated cruelty. But you're standing there blushing because you mentioned clothes, and it's... She couldn't finish. The laughter turned to sobs, and suddenly this poised woman was crumpling, all that careful control disintegrating. Ethan moved without thinking, catching her before she hit the floor, supporting her weight as 8 years of living alone screamed at him that he had no idea what to do with a crying woman in his arms. I'm sorry, she gasped against his chest. I'm sorry. I shouldn't. You're fine. He kept his voice low and steady, one hand carefully patting her back in what he hoped was a comforting gesture. You're safe here. I promise you that. Whatever else happens, you're safe. She cried harder, and Ethan just held her, the stranger who was somehow his responsibility now, feeling her shake with the kind of tears that came from breaking points finally reached. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, lit by firelight and filled with the sound of grief finding release, something fragile and important was beginning. When her sobs finally quieted, Lillian pulled back, mortified. I apologize. That was inexcusable. It was human. Ethan released her carefully, stepping back to give her space. You've been through hell. Crying about it seems pretty reasonable. She wiped at her face with trembling hands, wincing when she accidentally touched the bruised side. I should let you rest. You've had a long day dealing with your unexpected situation. Lillian. He waited until she looked at him. You're not a situation. You're a person who needed help. And I'm glad I could give it. Now go change into something dry before you catch pneumonia. We can figure out everything else tomorrow. She nodded, moving toward the bedroom with her single carpet bag. At the doorway, she paused. Mr. Cole? Ethan. Just Ethan. Ethan. She tested his name like she was tasting something unfamiliar. Thank you for not sending me away, for giving me a chance. You don't need to thank me for basic decency. In my experience, basic decency is rarer than you'd think. She disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Ethan stood in his suddenly too quiet cabin, listening to the storm and the soft sounds of movement from behind that closed door, and wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into. One thing was certain, his carefully ordered, solitary life was over. What would replace it, he had no idea. But standing there, remembering the weight of Lillian Moore's grief in his arms and the fierce protectiveness that had risen in him, Ethan realized something unexpected. He didn't want his old life back. For the first time in 8 years, the silence felt less like peace and more like possibility. The storm would rage all night. By morning, everything would look different. But for now, in this moment, there was just a woman finding safety and a man learning what it meant to offer it. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like enough. Morning came with the kind of silence that only follows violent storms. Ethan woke on the floor by the fire, his back protesting the hard surface despite the bedroll he'd laid out. Pale light filtered through the cabin's small windows, and for a disorienting moment, he forgot why he wasn't in his own bed. Then he heard it, a soft sound from the bedroom, like someone trying very hard to move quietly and failing. Memory crashed back. Lillian. The bruises. The promise he'd made without fully understanding its weight. He sat up, running a hand through his hair, and tried to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do next. In his 8 years of solitude, mornings had followed a predictable pattern. Wake, start the fire, tend the animals, make coffee, work until exhaustion made him stop. Simple, uncomplicated. Now there was a woman in his bedroom, his former bedroom, and he had no idea what the protocol was for this situation. Did he knock? Did he start breakfast and hope she emerged on her own? Did he pretend everything was normal when nothing about this was remotely normal? The bedroom door opened before he could decide, and Lillian stepped out wearing one of his old flannel shirts over a pair of his work pants cinched tight with rope. The clothes swallowed her small frame, the shirt hanging nearly to her knees, the pants rolled up multiple times at the ankles. She'd attempted to tame her dark hair into a braid, but pieces had escaped to frame her face. Even with the bruises still vivid against her pale skin, even drowning in his oversized clothes, there was something striking about her. Maybe it was the way she held herself. That particular combination of fragility and steel that spoke to survival earned rather than given. "Good morning," she said, her cultured Boston accent sounding almost absurd in the rough cabin. "I hope I didn't wake you." "Been awake." Ethan stood, trying not to notice how the morning light caught in her eyes, that one good eye still shadowed with pain but clearer than yesterday. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in months." She moved toward the fire, still favoring her left side. "The bed is very comfortable. You should take it back tonight. I can sleep out here." "No." The flatness in his voice made her pause. "Ethan, I can't take your bed indefinitely. It's not right." "What's not right is making someone with broken ribs sleep on the floor." He saw her expression shift, surprised that he'd noticed. "I was a scout in the war. I know what damaged ribs look like. How many?" She wrapped her arms around herself, a protective gesture. "2, I think. Maybe 3. They're healing." "When?" "About 2 weeks ago. One of my uncle's associates felt I needed a stronger reminder about compliance." She said it in that same distant tone, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. He was very careful about placement, nothing that would show an address. Ethan's hands clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice level. "You need to take it easy. No heavy lifting, no twisting wrong. Ribs take time." "I told you I'd earn my keep. And I told you that's not necessary." He moved to the stove, grateful for something to do with his hands. "But if you want to feel useful, you could make coffee while I tend the animals. Everything you need is on that shelf." He expected argument, but Lillian just nodded and moved to examine the supplies. "I've never actually made coffee without servants. My uncle's kitchen was forbidden territory." "It's not complicated. Water, grounds, heat. Hard to ruin." He pulled on his coat, still damp from yesterday's storm. "I'll be back in about an hour. Don't try to do anything that involves lifting or reaching high. And don't go outside. The yard's a mud pit after that rain." "Ethan." She turns to face him, something uncertain in her expression. "Thank you. For the bed, for the space, for not expecting anything." He wanted to tell her that gratitude for basic decency was a damning indictment of every man she'd known before. Instead, he just nodded and headed out into the cold morning air. The barnyard was, as predicted, a disaster of mud and standing water. Ethan slogged through it to check on the animals, finding them all comfortable despite the storm. Bess nickered a greeting as he brought fresh hay, and Bessie the cow needed milking. The chickens were cranky about the mud, but otherwise fine. As he worked, his mind kept circling back to the woman in his cabin. What was he supposed to do with her? The practical considerations were straightforward enough. She needed time to heal, food to regain strength, safety from whoever might come looking. But the emotional landscape was far more complex. They were legally bound by a contract neither had fully understood when they'd entered into it. She'd come here expecting to fulfill some obligation, and he'd been expecting, what? A companion, a wife, someone to make the silence less oppressive? He'd gotten something far more complicated. A broken woman with a Boston education and a spine made of iron who looked at his rough cabin like it was sanctuary instead of poverty. A woman who made him feel protective and confused and slightly terrified all at once. The milk pail was nearly full when Ethan realized he'd been sitting on the stool for 10 minutes, lost in thought while Bessie patiently chewed her hay. He shook himself, finished the milking, and headed back to the cabin with the pail and a basket of eggs. The smell hit him as soon as he opened the door, coffee and something else. Bread? He stepped inside to find Lillian at the stove, her face flushed from the heat, carefully watching something in his cast-iron skillet. "I found flour and eggs," she said without turning around. "I thought I'd attempt breakfast. Fair warning, I've never actually cooked anything before. This might be inedible." Ethan set down the milk and eggs, moving to peer over her shoulder. In the skillet, some kind of flatbread was cooking, golden and imperfect but real. That's not inedible. It's not done yet. Reserve judgment. But he could hear the pride in her voice, tentative and new. "I read a cookbook once. Apparently that doesn't actually count as experience." Book learning, still learning. He poured himself coffee, strong enough to strip paint but drinkable, and settled at the table to watch her work. There was something mesmerizing about seeing her in his space, wearing his clothes, attempting to make food in his kitchen with the focused determination of someone proving something to themselves. The flatbread came out slightly burned on one side, but mostly edible. They ate it with butter and honey Ethan had traded for last month, and despite the imperfections, it was one of the better meals he'd had in recent memory. Maybe it was the novelty of not eating alone. Maybe it was watching Lillian's face light up when she realized she'd successfully made something. Either way, he found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't expected. "Tell me about the homestead," Lillian said, breaking the comfortable silence. "What needs doing? What's your routine?" "Depends on the season. Right now we're heading into winter, so it's about preparation. Making sure the barn's secure, checking fences, getting wood split and stacked, preserving what food we can. Come spring, it's planting, vegetables mostly, some wheat. Summer's about maintaining crops and animals, fixing whatever broke over winter. Fall's harvest and preparation all over again." "It sounds like the work never stops." "It doesn't. That's frontier life." He studied her over his coffee. "I won't lie to you. Winters out here are hard. Snow can pile up 6 feet deep. Temperatures drop so low your breath freezes. Sometimes you don't see another person for weeks. It's isolating and brutal, and people go a little crazy from it. And you've survived it alone for 8 years. Surviving's different from thriving." He hadn't meant to say that, hadn't meant to reveal that particular truth. "Point is, you should know what you're getting into." Lillian was quiet for a moment, tracing patterns in the honey on her plate. "Ethan, what do you want from me? Honestly, not what you think you should want or what the contract says. What do you actually want?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought I wanted a wife, someone to share this life with. But that was before you arrived, before I saw—" He gestured vaguely at her fading bruises. "You've been through hell. You need time to figure out who you are when you're not running or afraid. Pushing you into anything right now would make me no better than your uncle. So you want nothing? I want you to heal. I want you to feel safe. Beyond that?" He shrugged. "We'll figure it out as we go." She looked at him with that expression he was starting to recognize, the one that said she couldn't quite believe he was real. You're a very strange man, Ethan Cole. I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as one. They fell into a routine over the following days, learning each other's rhythms the way strangers forced into proximity must. Ethan handled the heavy work, splitting wood, repairing fences, hunting for winter meat. Lillian took over what cooking she could manage, teaching herself through trial and error that produced more errors than successes at first. She couldn't lift heavy pots with her damaged ribs, couldn't reach the high shelves, couldn't work for long periods without needing rest. But she tried, with a determination that was both admirable and slightly worrying. "You don't have to prove anything," Ethan told her one afternoon, finding her struggling to haul water from the well with obvious pain. "I have to prove it to myself." She set down the bucket, breathing hard. "I've spent 7 years being told I was useless except as a source of income. I need to know I'm capable of something." "You are capable. You survived years of abuse and had the courage to run. That's not nothing." "It doesn't feel like enough." Ethan took the bucket from her, noting how she didn't quite hide her relief. "How about this? You teach me to read better. I can manage, but you went to fancy schools. We trade skills. I teach you frontier survival. You teach me whatever it is educated people know." Her eyes lit up. "You'd want that?" "Why not? Winter's coming. We'll have time." So that became part of their routine too. After dinner, they'd sit by the fire, Lillian in one of the mismatched chairs, Ethan on the floor with his back against the log wall, and she'd read aloud from his small collection of books. Her voice transformed the rough words into something almost musical, breathing life into stories he'd read a dozen times before. Sometimes she'd stop and explain things, historical context or literary references or just interesting facts she'd learned. Ethan found himself fascinated not just by the information, but by the way her whole face changed when she talked about something that excited her. The guarded wariness would fall away, replaced by an enthusiasm that made her look younger, less damaged. "You miss it," he said one evening, watching her explain the political context of a poem they'd been reading. "That world, education, culture." Lillian's animation faded slightly. "I miss parts of it. Museums, libraries, concerts, the way ideas were currency among certain circles. But I don't miss the cage it came in. The expectations, the performance, the way women were decorative objects designed to enhance men's status." "Your uncle part of that world?" "Very much so. He collected people the way others collect art, for show and investment value. I was supposed to be proof of his benevolence, the tragic orphan he so generously took in." Her voice went bitter. "What no one saw was what happened behind closed doors. People must have noticed something, the bruises. Could be explained away. A fall down the stairs, a riding accident. Boston society excels at looking the other way when acknowledging problems would be socially inconvenient." She set down the book. "Besides, I learned to hide it. Makeup, careful positioning, strategic clothing. By the end, I was an expert at concealment." "That's a hell of a skill to need." "Yes, it is." She met his eyes. "But it's behind me now. Or at least I'm trying to make it be behind me." Ethan wanted to promise her that it was, that her uncle would never find her, that she was safe forever. But he'd seen too much of the world to make promises he couldn't guarantee. Instead, he just nodded and let her continue reading. 2 weeks after her arrival, Ethan woke to find Lillian already up, attempting to make bread. The kitchen was a disaster, flour everywhere, something that might have been dough abandoned on the table, and Lillian herself covered in white powder, looking frustrated to the point of tears. "I can't get it right," she said before he could ask. "I've tried 3 times, and it won't cooperate." Ethan surveyed the damage, biting back a smile. "Bread's tricky, takes practice." "I don't have practice. I don't have any useful skills at all." She sank into a chair, defeat written across her features. "I can discuss philosophy and play mediocre piano and identify 7 different types of roses, but I can't make bread. What kind of frontier wife can't make bread?" "The kind who's been here 2 weeks. He moved to the table examining her abandoned dough. "This isn't bad, actually. Just needs more kneading and time to rise. Here, let me show you." He expected resistance, but Lillian just moved aside, watching intently as he demonstrated the technique his mother had taught him a lifetime ago. After a minute, he guided her hands to the dough, showing her the rhythm and pressure needed. "Like this," he said, his hands over hers. "Feel how it starts to change. That's the gluten developing." He was acutely aware of how close they were standing, how small her hands felt under his, how she smelled faintly of flour and honey and something else uniquely her. When he stepped back, his heart was beating faster than the simple instruction warranted. If Lillian noticed, she didn't comment. She just continued kneading with the focused determination she brought to everything, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. The bread that finally emerged from the oven hours later was imperfect, but real, golden and crusty and filling the cabin with a smell that made Ethan's mouth water. Lillian stared at it like she'd created something miraculous. "I made bread," she whispered. "You did." "I actually made bread." She looked up at him with such joy that Ethan felt something shift in his chest. "Ethan, I made bread." Her laughter was bright and genuine, and before he fully processed what he was doing, Ethan found himself laughing too. They stood in his flour-covered kitchen, laughing over a single loaf of bread like it was the finest thing either had ever seen. And maybe, in its way, it was. The first snow came 3 weeks after Lillian's arrival, overnight and heavy. Ethan woke to an unnaturally bright cabin and knew before he looked outside what he'd find. When he opened the door, the world had transformed into a pristine white landscape that buried everything under at least 8 inches of powder. Lillian emerged from the bedroom, wrapped in a blanket, and gasped at the sight. "It's beautiful." "It's work," Ethan corrected, but even he had to admit there was something striking about fresh snow and morning light. "Need to clear a path to the barn, make sure the animals are okay, check the roof." "Can I help?" "You can watch from inside where it's warm." But Lillian, predictably, ignored him. She bundled herself in every piece of spare clothing she could find, creating a ridiculous layered outfit that made her look like a child playing dress-up, and insisted on following him out. The snow came up to her knees, making each step a struggle. Ethan watched her determinedly wade through it, refusing to admit defeat even when she was clearly exhausted. He wanted to tell her to go inside, to rest, to stop pushing herself so hard. Instead, he found himself showing her how to scatter feed for the chickens, how to break ice on the water trough, how to check for drafts in the barn walls. She was terrible at all of it, naturally, but she tried, and that seemed to matter more to her than success. "Why do you do this?" Ethan finally asked, watching her struggle with a task that should have been simple. "Push yourself this hard?" Lillian paused, breathing heavily from exertion. "Because for 7 years I was told I was useless, ornamental at best. I need to prove to myself more than anyone that I'm more than what he made me believe I was." "You're already more than that." "How do you know?" She turned to face him, her cheeks flushed from cold and effort. "You've known me less than a month. For all you know, my uncle was right about me." "Your uncle," Ethan said carefully, "was a man who hurt someone weaker than himself and called it discipline. His opinion on anything is worth less than nothing." She stared at him, something complicated moving behind her eyes. Then, without warning, she moved forward and hugged him, quick and awkward, her arms barely able to reach around his heavy coat, gone before he could react. "Thank you," she whispered, then turned and hurried back toward the cabin, leaving Ethan standing in the snow, wondering what exactly had just happened. December arrived with brutal cold and shorter days. The isolation Ethan had warned about became real. They were truly alone now, cut off by snow and distance from the rest of humanity. He watched Lillian carefully for signs of cabin fever, the restless madness that came from too much time in too small a space. Instead, she seemed to thrive. She'd taken over the cooking completely now, producing meals that were increasingly edible and occasionally good. She'd organized his chaotic collection of supplies into something resembling order. She'd even started mending his clothes, teaching herself to sew with the same determined focus she brought to everything. And she read. Every evening, without fail, she'd read aloud while Ethan worked on whatever needed fixing. Her voice had become the soundtrack to his evenings, something he realized he'd been missing without knowing it all these isolated years. "I've been thinking," she said one night, setting down her book, "about the marriage contract." Ethan's hand stilled on the leather harness he was repairing. "Yeah?" "It expires in 2 months. February 15th, to be exact. She wasn't looking at him, her eyes fixed on the fire. I want you to know that I don't expect you to honor it. You've done more than enough by giving me shelter and safety. If you want to dissolve the arrangement when the time comes, I'll understand completely. Where would you go? I don't know. Maybe one of the towns. I could find work as a teacher or governess. I'm educated, I can... You hate the idea. It wasn't a question. He could hear it in her voice, the way she was trying to convince herself of something she didn't believe. I hate the idea of trapping you in something you didn't choose. Not really. You asked for a wife, and you got a charity case. Ethan set down the harness, giving her his full attention. You want to know what I think? I'm not sure. I think, he said slowly, that you're the bravest person I've ever met. I think you've survived things that would have broken most people. I think you make this cabin feel less empty and these long nights less lonely. And I think that if you wanted to stay, not because of some contract, but because you chose to, I'd be glad of it. Lillian's good eye had gone suspiciously bright. You don't know me well enough to make that judgment, don't I? I've watched you teach yourself to cook and clean and manage a frontier household with no training. I've seen you push through pain to prove something to yourself. I've listened to you read every night and watched your face light up when you talk about ideas. He paused. I know you're terrified of storms but won't admit it. I know you have nightmares that make you cry out sometimes. I know you're still healing inside and out. Maybe I don't know your favorite color or what you wanted to be when you were a child, but I know the things that matter. My favorite color is blue, she whispered. Deep blue, like the ocean. And when I was a child, I wanted to be an explorer. See? Already learning more. A laugh escaped her, watery but real. You're too good, Ethan Cole. It makes me nervous. I'm not good. I'm just not terrible. There's a difference. In my experience, not being terrible puts you far ahead of most men. The bitterness in her voice reminded Ethan that her wounds went deeper than physical bruises. She'd been taught by her uncle and his associates that men were fundamentally dangerous, that kindness was just manipulation by another name. Changing that belief would take more than a few weeks of decent behavior. I'm not most men, he said quietly, and I'm not your uncle. Whatever happens between us, it'll be because we both choose it. No obligation, no pressure, just choice. Why? The question burst from her. Why are you like this? What do you get out of being patient and kind and asking for nothing in return? Maybe I get a less lonely cabin and someone who reads to me at night. Maybe I get to watch someone discover they're stronger than they thought. Maybe... He stopped, unsure how to articulate what he was feeling. Maybe I just get to be better than I've been. That enough? Lillian was crying now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. I don't know how to accept this. Kindness without cost. Safety without strings. It feels wrong, like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. No other shoe, just this, what you see. Nothing hidden, nothing owed. She wiped at her face, leaving smudges from the fire's soot. I want to believe you. Then believe me, you've got 2 months until that contract expires. Use them to decide what you want, not what you think you should want or what's practical or safe. What you actually want. And if I don't know, then we figure it out together. The conversation shifted something between them. Lillian became less cautiously grateful and more genuinely present, as if permission to want things had unlocked something she'd kept carefully contained. She asked questions about his past, about the war, and what brought him to Montana, and why he'd chosen solitude. In return, she shared pieces of her own history, not the trauma, but the good parts. Her childhood before her parents died, the books she'd loved, the dreams she'd had before her uncle had crushed them systematically. They were learning each other, Ethan realized, really learning, beyond the surface necessity of cohabitation. He discovered she had a wry sense of humor that emerged when she felt safe, that she sang while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her, that she was fiercely competitive about everything, even tasks she'd never attempted before. She learned he was quieter than he seemed, that his silence wasn't emptiness but observation, that he had strong opinions about everything from politics to proper fence construction, but rarely shared them unless asked. That beneath his gruff exterior lived someone capable of unexpected gentleness. Christmas came and went quietly. Ethan had never been one for celebration, but Lillian seemed determined to mark the day somehow. She'd made him a shirt from fabric she'd found in his supplies, the stitching crooked but functional. He'd carved her a bookmark from a piece of cedar, simple but smooth. "I've never had a gift made just for me," she said, turning the bookmark over in her hands like it was precious. Everything before was about appearances, expensive things meant to be displayed. "It's just wood." "It's thoughtful. That's worth more than expensive." They sat by the fire that night, and Lillian told him about Christmases from her childhood, her parents' laughter, the smell of her mother's cooking, the joy before it had all been taken away. Ethan listened and understood that she was giving him something valuable, memories of happiness before trauma, proof that she'd once known love. In return, he told her about his sister, dead now 5 years from pneumonia, about how she'd been the one who taught him to read, who'd insisted he could be more than their father's violence had suggested, about how her death had been part of what drove him west, seeking distance from grief. They were sharing wounds, Ethan realized, not to compare suffering, but to acknowledge it, to say, "I've been damaged too," and find comfort in mutual understanding. January brought a cold snap so severe that Ethan worried about the animals surviving it. He spent days in the barn, keeping fires going, making sure no one froze. Lillian brought him meals and stayed with him, refusing to leave him alone in the bitter cold, even when he insisted she should return to the cabin's warmth. "We're in this together," she said stubbornly, wrapped in every blanket they owned. "That's what partnership means, right? You don't face things alone when there's someone who can help." Partnership. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. They weren't just cohabitating strangers anymore, weren't just fulfilling a contract. Somewhere in the past 2 months, they'd become something else. What exactly, Ethan wasn't sure. But it felt like the foundation of something real. One night, trapped in the barn by particularly vicious wind, Lillian asked him the question he'd been waiting for. "What do you want, Ethan? Really want? Not from me specifically, but from life." He thought about it, watching the horses doze in their stalls. "Used to be I wanted peace. After the war, after losing my sister, I just wanted quiet and control over my own life. Built this place thinking that was enough. But it wasn't? It was, for a while. But 8 years is a long time to live with only your own thoughts for company. Started realizing that peace without connection is just another kind of emptiness." He glanced at her, bundled and half-frozen but stubbornly present. "Then you showed up, and the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt lonely. Is that good or bad?" "Still figuring that out." He smiled slightly. "What about you? What do you want?" Lillian was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then, softly, "I want to stop being afraid. I want to wake up without checking shadows for threats. I want to trust that kindness is real, not manipulation. I want—" Her voice caught. "I want to believe I deserve good things." "You do deserve good things. Knowing it intellectually and believing it emotionally are different battles." She pulled the blankets tighter. "But being here with you, I'm starting to think maybe it's possible. Maybe I can become someone who isn't defined by what was done to her." "You already are that person. You just need time to see it." She looked at him then, really looked, and Ethan saw something shift in her expression, a decision being made, a wall coming down. "Ask me in February," she whispered, "when the contract expires. Ask me what I want, and I'll give you a real answer." "I'll ask." They sat in companionable silence after that, listening to the wind howl and the horses breathe, and Ethan felt something settle in his chest. He didn't know what February would bring, what answer Lillian would give, but for the first time since she'd arrived, he allowed himself to hope it might be the one he was starting to realize he wanted. February arrived with deceptive gentleness, a thaw that melted the worst of the snow and turned the world into mud and promise. Ethan watched the calendar with an awareness that felt almost painful, counting down days until the contract expired and Lillian would have to make her choice. They'd fallen into a rhythm so natural it felt like they'd been living this way for years rather than months. Her reading by the fire while he worked, shared meals where conversation flowed easily, quiet moments that didn't need filling with words. He was in love with her. The realization had crept up on him gradually, then hit all at once one morning when he'd watched her laugh at something one of the chickens had done, her whole face transformed by joy. He loved her courage, her determination, the way she'd rebuilt herself piece by piece from the wreckage her uncle had made. He loved her sharp mind and her terrible cooking that was slowly becoming less terrible. He loved how she made his empty cabin feel like home. But love didn't mean possession, and he'd promised her choice. So he kept his feelings locked away and waited for February 15th, trying not to hope too hard for an answer he had no right to expect. The decision was taken out of both their hands on February 10th. Ethan was in town picking up supplies, leaving Lillian at the homestead with strict instructions to stay inside and rest. Her ribs were finally healed, but she'd been pushing herself hard lately, preparing for whatever future she'd decided on. The trip to Benton's Crossing should have been routine, a few hours at most. He was loading flour into the wagon when Harold Benson approached, his expression troubled in a way that immediately set Ethan's instincts on alert. "Ethan, you got a minute? What's wrong?" Harold glanced around, lowering his voice. "Had some strangers come through yesterday asking questions. Well-dressed fellow and two men who looked like hired muscle. The fancy one was asking about mail-order brides, specifically any that might have come through from Boston around September." Ice flooded Ethan's veins. "What'd you tell them?" "Nothing. Said we get lots of people through, can't keep track of everyone. But Ethan, this fellow, he was persistent. Offered money for information. Some folks in town might not be as circumspect as me, especially with winter being hard and cash being scarce." "Where are they now?" "Checked into Martha's boarding house. Said they'd be staying a few days, making inquiries." Harold's weathered face creased with concern. "I don't know your business with Miss Moore, and I'm not asking, but if she's running from something, you should know it might have caught up." Ethan's mind raced, calculating distances and options, and the brutal reality that his isolated homestead, which had seemed like perfect sanctuary, was now a trap. "How many people know where I live?" "Most everyone in town, at least generally. You've been trading here for 8 years. People know you're north of here, about 8 miles. Harold paused. "You thinking these men mean her harm?" "I'm thinking they're here for her, and not for any good reason." "Then you'd better move fast. Town talk travels, and someone's bound to mention your place once enough money changes hands." Harold handed Ethan his change. "Whatever you need, Ethan, you let me know. Some of us remember how you helped Thomas Whitmore's boy when he got lost in that blizzard 2 years back. We don't forget." Ethan nodded his thanks and finished loading supplies with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. His mind was already miles ahead, planning. He needed to get back to Lillian, needed to warn her, needed to figure out their next move before her uncle's men showed up at his door. The ride home felt endless, every mile an agony of imagined disasters. What if they'd already found the homestead? What if Lillian was already gone, dragged back to Boston, and the nightmare, she'd escaped? The contract expired in 5 days. 5 days until she would have been free to make her own choice without legal complication. 5 days they apparently didn't have. The homestead looked peaceful as he approached, smoke rising from the chimney, everything exactly as he'd left it. Ethan didn't relax. He pulled the wagon up fast, not bothering to unhitch Bess before striding to the cabin door. Lillian looked up from the shirt she was mending, her smile fading as she registered his expression. "What happened?" "Your uncle found you. Or at least he found Boston marriage records and traced you to Benton's Crossing." Ethan closed the door, his mind still racing through options. "He's got men in town asking questions. It's only a matter of time before someone points them this direction." He watched the color drain from her face, watched her hands go still on the fabric. "How long?" "A day, maybe 2 if we're lucky. Depends on how fast word spreads and how much money he's offering." He moved to the bedroom, pulling out his rifle and checking the ammunition. "We need to decide our next move." "I should run." Lillian stood, setting aside the mending with trembling hands. "Head further west, find another town, another name. And then what? He found you once, he'll find you again. Men like your uncle don't give up when there's money involved." Ethan returned to the main room, rifle in hand. "Besides, you're done running." "I don't have a choice." "You always have a choice." He set the rifle down, moving to face her directly. Here's what I'm thinking. The contract says we can marry any time in the first 6 months. We're still within that window. If we marry now, legally, you become my wife. My responsibility. That complicates things for him. Lillian shook her head. Ethan, no. I won't trap you into marriage because my past caught up with me. That's not fair to you. Fair? He heard his voice rise and forced it level again. You think what's fair is letting those men drag you back to Boston so your uncle can finish what he started? You think it's fair that you finally found safety and now it's being ripped away? It's not your fight. The hell it isn't. The words came out harder than he'd intended, but he didn't soften them. You've been living under my roof for 5 months. You've become... He stopped, struggling with words that felt too big and too honest. You matter, Lillian, to me. And I'm not letting anyone take you. She stared at him, something complicated moving behind her eyes. You're talking about marriage, real marriage, legal and binding. That's not something you can take back once it's done. I know what I'm talking about. But the contract expires in 5 days. You were going to ask me what I wanted, remember? Let me choose freely? Her voice cracked slightly. This isn't choosing. This is desperation and fear and reacting to a threat. That's not how I want to make this decision. Ethan understood what she was saying. She'd spent 7 years having choices stripped away, and now he was doing the same thing, just with better intentions. The realization sat heavy in his chest. You're right, he said quietly. I'm sorry, I'm just... He ran a hand through his hair. I'm trying to protect you, and I'm doing it wrong. You're doing it exactly right, which is why this is so hard. Lillian moved closer, her expression torn between fear and something else. Ethan, if we marry now, out of necessity, I'll never know if it's what you really wanted. And you'll never know if I would have chosen you anyway. I already know... He stopped himself. Now wasn't the time for confessions, not when they were both scared and making decisions that could shape the rest of their lives. What? She searched his face. What do you already know? Before he could answer, they heard it, the distant sound of horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving at a deliberate pace. Ethan moved to the window, peering out through the gap in the curtain. 3 men. The one in front sat his horse like someone unused to riding, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as city-bred despite his attempt at frontier dress. Behind him rode 2 larger men, their bearing suggesting exactly the kind of hired violence Harold had described. Is that him? Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer from the way Lillian had gone rigid beside him. That's him. Her voice was barely a whisper. Richard Moore, my uncle. The men pulled up in the yard, and Ethan watched Richard Moore survey the homestead with an expression of barely concealed disdain. He was in his late 40s, well-groomed, with the kind of face that probably looked trustworthy in a Boston courtroom. Ethan hated him on sight. Stay behind me, Ethan told Lillian, moving toward the door with his rifle. And no matter what happens, remember, you don't owe him anything. Not explanations, not compliance, not fear. She nodded, her face pale but set with determination. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, rifle held casually but obviously. Help you gentlemen with something? Richard Moore dismounted with the careful movements of someone unfamiliar with horses, his expensive boots squelching in the mud. Mr. Cole, I presume. Richard Moore, attorney at law from Boston. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Don't own anything that belongs to you. My niece. Moore's cultured voice carried easily across the yard. Lillian Moore. I have information suggesting she arrived here last September through a rather irregular marriage arrangement. I've come to retrieve her and return her to her proper home. Your niece is an adult. She can go wherever she pleases. Actually, as her legal guardian until she reaches 25 or marries, I maintain certain rights and responsibilities. Moore pulled a folded document from his coat. I have papers here establishing my guardianship and her mental incapacity to make sound decisions. A physician in Boston has documented her tendency toward hysteria and irrational behavior. Ethan felt rage building but kept his voice level. Convenient how that medical opinion supports exactly what you need it to. The law is the law, Mr. Cole. I'm sure a simple frontiersman such as yourself can appreciate that. Moore's tone dripped with condescension. Now, if you'll simply hand over my niece, we can resolve this without unpleasantness. She's not property to be handed over. She is a confused young woman who ran away from her responsibilities and the care of her family. I'm here to bring her home where she belongs. Moore's expression hardened. I can do this civilly, or I can involve the territorial marshal. Your choice. Behind Ethan, the cabin door opened. Lillian stepped out, and he heard her sharp intake of breath, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she moved to stand beside him, her presence a declaration. Hello, Uncle Richard. Her voice was steady despite the fear Ethan could feel radiating from her. I see you've gone to considerable trouble to find me. Lillian? Moore's face arranged itself into an expression of concern that didn't reach his eyes. Thank heavens you're safe. When you disappeared, I was beside myself with worry. Your maid finally confessed she'd helped you run to some marriage agency scheme. I've been searching for months. I'm fine, as you can see. Are you? Living in this hovel with a stranger? Surely you can see this is beneath you, beneath your breeding and education. Moore's tone shifted, becoming almost gentle. Come home, dear. All is forgiven. We can forget this unfortunate episode. I'm not coming back. Lillian, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. She straightened, and Ethan felt fierce pride at her courage. I'm making the choice to stay here, where I'm safe and treated with respect, where no one hurts me for refusing to comply with their plans. Moore's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold beneath. You're speaking of discipline, which any responsible guardian must occasionally employ. You are always prone to dramatics. Is that what you call it? Lillian's voice rose. Discipline? Starving me? Having your associates beat me when I wouldn't agree to marry your business partner? That's not discipline, Uncle Richard. That's abuse. Careful, Lillian. Moore's voice went soft and dangerous. You're making serious accusations against a respected attorney. Accusations that a man of my standing could easily disprove, especially given your documented mental instability. The only documentation of that exists in papers you had forged. She was shaking now, but she didn't back down. You needed me declared incompetent so you could control my inheritance. But I'm not incompetent, and I'm not coming back to let you finish what you started. You don't have a choice. Moore pulled another document from his coat. This is a writ of guardianship signed by a judge in Boston. It gives me legal authority to retrieve you by whatever means necessary. Now, you can come peacefully, or these gentlemen, he gestured to his hired men, can assist you. Ethan stepped forward, putting himself between Lillian and the threat. That paper might mean something in Boston. Out here, it's just ink, and the lady said no. Mr. Cole, I strongly advise you not to interfere in family matters. Moore's expression hardened completely. Harboring a mentally incompetent woman against her guardian's wishes is a serious offense. I could have you arrested. Try it. The two hired men shifted on their horses, hands moving toward weapons they kept concealed but obvious. Ethan didn't raise his rifle, but his grip tightened imperceptibly. This is your last opportunity to resolve this civilly, Moore said. Hand over my niece, and we'll leave peacefully. Refuse, and I'll return with the marshal and enough men to ensure compliance. Lillian's hand found Ethan's arm, her fingers digging in with desperate strength. He could feel her trembling, could sense her fighting not to give in to the fear her uncle was deliberately cultivating. Years of conditioning warred with months of healing, and Ethan realized with sudden clarity what needed to happen. You want to talk about legal rights? Ethan said, an idea forming even as he spoke. Fine. Let's talk about them. Miss Moore came here under a marriage contract arranged by a Boston agency. That contract gives us 6 months to formalize the marriage, and we're still within that time frame. A contract signed by an incompetent party is invalid, Moore countered smoothly, except she wasn't declared incompetent when she signed it. That convenient medical opinion came after, didn't it? Ethan felt Lillian's grip tighten, which means at the time of signing, she had full legal capacity to enter into contracts. Moore's jaw clenched. That's a technicality. Laws built on technicalities. You said so yourself. Ethan glanced at Lillian, seeing understanding dawn in her eyes. The question is simple. We can marry right now, make it legal and binding, and then you've got no claim because guardianship ends with marriage. Or you can try to take her by force, and we can see how well that works out for you. You're bluffing. But Moore's voice had lost some of its confidence. Am I? Ethan turned slightly to Lillian, keeping Moore in his peripheral vision. It's your choice. Always your choice. But if you want to end this now, permanently, I'm offering. Lillian looked between Ethan and her uncle, and he watched her face transform, fear giving way to calculation, then to something that looked like fierce determination. You'd marry me? Right now? Just to protect me from him? I'd marry you because you asked me to, Ethan said quietly. The protection is just a bonus. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she nodded once, sharply. Then let's do it. Now. Lillian, you're being irrational. Moore started forward, but Ethan's rifle came up in a smooth motion that stopped him cold. The lady's made her choice. Respect it. This is ridiculous. You can't just marry on a whim out here in the wilderness. There are procedures, licenses, witnesses. Actually, a new voice called out, all you need in Montana Territory is a willing couple and someone authorized to perform the ceremony. They all turned to see Thomas Whitmore riding up on his chestnut gelding, his weathered face split with a grin that didn't quite hide the concern in his eyes. Behind him rode Harold Benson and two other men from town, all armed and looking decidedly unfriendly toward the Boston strangers. Thomas, Ethan said, relief flooding through him, what are you doing here? Harold sent his boy riding like hell to my place, said there might be trouble at your homestead, figured you could use some friendly witnesses. Thomas dismounted, moving to stand with Ethan. And as it happens, I'm authorized to perform marriages, being a territorial justice of the peace, beneficial for 3 years now. Moore's face had gone mottled with anger. This is absurd. You can't possibly, can and will, if the parties are willing. Thomas looked at Lillian. Miss Moore, I presume, are you entering this marriage of your own free will, without coercion or force? I am, Lillian said clearly, her voice carrying across the yard. And you, Ethan? Same question. My own free will, Ethan confirmed. Then let's make this official before our Boston friend here has an apoplexy. Thomas pulled a small Bible from his saddlebag. Ethan hadn't known he carried one, and moved to stand between them. Normally I'd do this in town with more ceremony, but I'd say circumstances warrant some flexibility. Moore was sputtering protests, but Harold and the other men had positioned themselves in a way that made it clear they weren't going anywhere. The hired muscle looked uncertain, outnumbered now, and probably calculating whether their pay was worth getting shot over. Ethan Cole, Thomas began, his voice taking on a formal tone. Do you take this woman, Lillian Moore, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, until death do you part? Ethan looked at Lillian, really looked, seeing past the fear and the desperate circumstances to the woman who'd transformed his empty cabin into a home, who'd taught herself to survive in a world completely foreign to her, who'd fought her way back from trauma with nothing but stubborn courage. This wasn't how he'd imagined proposing, wasn't the romantic moment either of them deserved. But looking into her eyes, he found he didn't care about circumstances. Only choice. I do, he said, meaning it completely. Lillian Moore, Thomas continued, do you take this man, Ethan Cole, to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, until death do you part? Lillian's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. I do. Then by the authority vested in me by Montana Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas smiled. Ethan, you may kiss your bride. Ethan had never kissed anyone before, not in any way that mattered. He moved slowly, giving Lillian every chance to retreat, but she stepped into it, rising on her toes to meet him halfway. The kiss was brief and chaste, complicated by the fact that they had an audience and were both terrified for entirely different reasons. But it was real, and it was theirs. When they pulled apart, Thomas was grinning. Congratulations, you're now legally married in Montana Territory. This is a farce, Moore spat. I'll have it annulled. I'll take this to the territorial governor. You do that, Thomas said mildly, but you'll find the marriage is legal and binding. Miss Moore, excuse me, Mrs. Cole, was of legal age and sound mind when she consented. Your guardianship ended the moment she spoke her vows. Whatever claim you think you had is done. Her inheritance is hers, Lillian said, finding her voice. Or rather, it will be when I turn 25 in 3 years, and you have no legal access to it now that I'm married. Whatever scheme you and your business partner had dies here. Moore's expression went through several rapid changes before settling on cold fury. You stupid, ungrateful girl. I gave you everything, a home, education, opportunities. You gave me nothing I didn't already own by right of my parents' death, Lillian shot back. And you took everything else, my safety, my autonomy, my sense of self. You tried to sell me to a man who would have killed me for convenience, all so you could keep stealing from my inheritance. Well, it's over now. I'm not your ward anymore. I'm not your property. I'm done. The transformation in her was stunning. This was the woman she would have become without her uncle's systematic destruction, strong and articulate and refusing to be diminished. Ethan felt that fierce pride again, mixed with something deeper and more complex. You'll regret this, Moore said, his cultured veneer completely gone now. Both of you. I have resources, connections, and we have each other, Ethan interrupted, and friends who will stand with us, and a legal marriage you can't touch. So I'd suggest you take your hired thugs and ride back to Boston before this gets any uglier. Moore stared at them with naked hatred, and for a moment Ethan thought he might actually try something violent. Then Harold stepped forward, rifle held ready, and the moment passed. You heard the man, Harold said. Time for you to leave. And if you're thinking about coming back with more trouble, remember that Montana Territory has a way of making problems disappear if they get too persistent. We take care of our own out here. It was a threat, polite, but unmistakable. Moore heard it clearly, his face going white with impotent rage. This isn't over. Yeah, it is, Thomas said. Now get. Moore mounted his horse with as much dignity as he could muster, which wasn't much. His hired men followed suit, clearly relieved to be leaving. As they rode out, Moore turned back one last time. You've made an enemy, Lillian. Don't forget that. No, Lillian called after him, her voice ringing clear. I've freed myself from one. There's a difference. They watched the 3 men ride away until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did Ethan feel the tension drain from his shoulders, leaving him almost dizzy with relief and the surreal awareness that he was now married to the woman standing beside him. Well, Thomas said, breaking the silence, that was more exciting than most weddings I perform. Usually there's just nervousness and bad cake. The men from town laughed, and the mood shifted from confrontational to almost celebratory. Harold clapped Ethan on the shoulder. Congratulations, you two. That was quite a show. How did you know to come? Lillian asked, still gripping Ethan's hand like it was the only solid thing in the world. Harold's boy rode out after those men left town asking pointed questions about your place, Thomas explained. Figured if trouble was coming, you'd need witnesses and support. Glad we made it in time. I don't know how to thank you, Ethan said, meaning it completely. No thanks needed. You've helped enough folks around here over the years. About time we returned the favor. Thomas tucked his Bible away. Though you might want to make this official with proper paperwork when you get to town. I'll file the marriage certificate, but getting it registered proper-like would be smart. We'll do that, Ethan promised. The men lingered a bit longer, making sure Moore and his thugs were really gone, offering congratulations and good-natured ribbing about Ethan finally getting hitched. Eventually, they mounted up and headed back to town, leaving Ethan and Lillian alone in the yard, legally married and still processing what had just happened. So, Lillian said after a long silence, we're married. Appears so. That wasn't exactly the way I imagined making this decision. She turned to face him fully, searching his expression. Ethan, I need to know, did you mean it? What you said to Thomas? Or was it just the right words to end the threat? I meant every word. He kept his voice steady, wanting her to hear the truth. I would have married you in 5 days if you'd asked. Or 5 months. Or never, if that's what you wanted. The timing got forced, but the choice was real. You barely know me. I know you well enough to know I want to spend the rest of my life learning more. The words came easier than he'd expected. I know you make me better. I know you're brave and stubborn and funny and so damn determined to prove you're not broken when anyone with eyes can see you're one of the strongest people I've ever met. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I wanted to choose you freely, without fear or desperation making the decision. You did choose me. You could have gone with him, could have decided the risk was too great or the timing was wrong. But you stood here and said, I do. And that was choice, Lillian, real choice. What if I made it for the wrong reasons? Then we figure it out together. That's what marriage means, right? Facing whatever comes together. He reached up to wipe away her tears with his thumb. I'm not going to lie and say this is ideal. We should have had more time, more certainty, more romance probably. But we've got what we've got, and I'm choosing to believe that's enough. She laughed through her tears. You're an optimist. I didn't know that about you. I'm practical. There's a difference. He pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his chest. We're married now, for better or worse, so let's make it better. They stood there in the muddy yard, holding each other while the February sun climbed higher, and Ethan felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't even known was unsettled. This wasn't the ending he'd planned, wasn't the story he'd expected to live. But holding Lillian, feeling her heart beat against his, he realized it was the one he wanted. Her past had finally caught up with her, and they'd faced it down together. Now they had a future to figure out, complicated and uncertain, and theirs. It was more than enough. The first night as husband and wife was awkward in ways neither of them had anticipated. They stood in the cabin after the others had left, the reality of their new legal status settling around them like snow. Quiet, pervasive, changing the landscape of everything they thought they understood. I should probably sleep out here, Ethan said, gesturing to his usual spot by the fire. Nothing needs to change just because we said some words. Lillian's expression shifted through several emotions he couldn't quite read. We're married, Ethan. Actually married. People will expect. I don't care what people expect. He kept his voice gentle but firm. This marriage started because you needed protection, not because we'd decided we were ready for everything marriage usually means. I'm not going to push you into anything. You're not pushing. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture he recognized as self-protection. But you're right. This happened so fast, and She paused, struggling for words. I don't know how to be a wife, not a real one. My uncle's lessons on marriage involved submission and obedience, and I know that's not what you want, but I don't have another model. Then we make our own model. Ethan moved to bank the fire, giving himself something to do with his hands. We take this slow, figure out what works for us. No expectations, no timeline. Just two people learning how to be married in a way that doesn't break either of us. That's very patient of you. I've got time. He glanced at her, offering a slight smile. We've got the rest of our lives, apparently. No rush. She returned the smile, tentative but real. The rest of our lives. That's a strange thought. Terrifying or comforting? Both. Lillian moved toward the bedroom, then paused at the doorway. Ethan? Thank you. For today, for standing up to him, for giving me the choice even when circumstances tried to take it away. I know this isn't what you planned when you wrote to that agency. Plans change, sometimes for the better. She disappeared into the bedroom, and Ethan settled by the fire, trying to convince himself that sleeping alone was fine, that nothing needed to be different just because the law now recognized what his heart had known for weeks. They were married, but they were also still learning each other, still healing from their respective wounds. Patience was the only gift he could offer that mattered. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, his dreams were full of Lillian's voice saying, I do, and the fierce pride he'd felt watching her stand up to the man who'd terrorized her for years. Morning brought the practical realities of married life crashing down. Ethan woke to find Lillian already up, attempting to make breakfast with an intensity that suggested she'd been awake for hours, anxiety translated into productive action. You didn't have to get up early, he said, watching her fuss over the stove. I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about everything. She didn't turn around, her focus fixed on the eggs she was scrambling with perhaps more vigor than necessary. Do you think he'll really leave, my uncle, or will he find some way to challenge the marriage? Thomas said the marriage is legal. Your uncle can challenge all he wants, but Montana territory law is clear. You were of age and sound mind when you consented. He's got no grounds. He has money and connections and a willingness to bend any rule that serves him. Lillian finally turned to face him, and Ethan saw the fear she'd been trying to hide. I know you think standing up to him was enough, but you don't know him like I do. He doesn't accept defeat. He'll find another angle. Then we'll face it when it comes. Ethan stood, moving to pour coffee. But Lillian, you can't live in fear of what he might do. That's letting him control you even when he's miles away. Easy to say when you haven't spent 7 years learning exactly how far his reach extends. She served the eggs, slightly overdone but edible, with hands that trembled just enough to notice. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be difficult. I'm just scared. That's normal. Hell, I'm a little scared too. He took a bite of eggs, chewing thoughtfully. Getting married in your front yard while facing down a man who wants to drag your wife back to Boston wasn't exactly in my plans for the week. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. Your wife. That's going to take getting used to. For both of us. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the weight of their new reality settling around them. Finally, Lillian spoke again, her voice quiet but determined. I want to go to town. Make the marriage official with proper paperwork like Thomas suggested. And I want to do it publicly, where people can see that I'm choosing this freely. So if my uncle does try to claim I was coerced or mentally incompetent, there are witnesses who know otherwise. That's smart thinking. I learned from watching him manipulate records and testimonies. If you're going to fight someone who uses the law as a weapon, you have to be more thorough than they are. She met his eyes, and I want to send a letter to Clara, my maid in Boston. She helped me escape, and she deserves to know I'm safe, that her risk paid off. We can do that. Ethan finished his coffee, already mentally planning the trip. Weather's good enough for travel. We'll go today, get everything documented properly. Thank you. Lillian's expression softened. For not dismissing my fears as paranoia. For taking this seriously. Your fears aren't paranoia when they're based on years of experience. I'd be a fool not to take them seriously. They prepared for the trip to Benton's Crossing with the kind of coordinated efficiency that spoke to how well they'd learned each other's rhythms over the past months. Lillian changed into her traveling dress, the same one she'd arrived in, now mended and cleaned but still showing signs of hard wear. Ethan hitched Bess to the wagon, checking everything twice. The ride to town was quiet, both of them lost in thought. The landscape was transforming with the thaw, mud giving way to the first hints of green as winter reluctantly loosened its grip. Ethan found himself acutely aware of Lillian beside him, the way she sat a little straighter now than when she'd first arrived, the way her eyes scanned the horizon with curiosity rather than fear. What are you thinking about? She asked, catching him watching her. How much you've changed since September. Is that good or bad? Good. Definitely good. He kept his eyes on the trail. You arrived looking like a strong wind would knock you over. Now you're talking about legally outmaneuvering a Boston attorney. That's growth. I had a good teacher. She glanced at him. You showed me what it looks like when someone acts with integrity. That made it easier to remember I used to have some of my own. You never lost it, just got buried under survival. Maybe. She was quiet for a moment. Ethan, can I ask you something? Always. Yesterday, when we got married, did any part of you resent having your hand forced, being pushed into this before you were ready? He considered the question carefully, wanting to give her honesty rather than comfortable lies. I resented the circumstances, hated that your uncle showed up and turned what should have been a choice into a necessity. But the actual marriage? He shook his head. No resentment there. If anything, I was grateful for the excuse to stop dancing around what I'd wanted to ask for weeks anyway. Really? She sounded surprised. You wanted to marry me? Even knowing everything you know about my past, about the complications I bring? Especially knowing all that. He guided Bess around a muddy patch. You think trauma makes you less worth having around? It doesn't. It just makes you human. Most men wouldn't see it that way. I'm not most men, and frankly, most men are idiots. She laughed, real laughter that transformed her whole face. That's probably true. Benton's Crossing came into view, and Ethan felt Lillian tense beside him. He understood why. Yesterday, this town had been where her uncle had tracked her down. Now they were returning to make their marriage public, to document it in ways that couldn't be erased or denied. It was both declaration and defense. Thomas Whitmore was waiting at his small office. He served as Justice of the Peace, Land Recorder, and General Legal Authority for the territory, all rolled into one. He looked up as they entered, a smile creasing his weathered face. Newlyweds. Come to make it official? We came to make sure there's no question about legality, Ethan said. Lillian wants documentation that can't be challenged. Smart woman. Thomas pulled out a thick ledger and several forms. Let's start with the marriage certificate. I filed the basic record yesterday, but we should get the full documentation complete. Names, dates, witnesses, the whole formal process. He walked them through it, asking questions and filling in forms with careful precision. When they reached the section about previous names and guardianship status, Lillian didn't hesitate. My guardian was Richard Moore of Boston, Massachusetts. That guardianship ended upon my marriage yesterday, February 10th, 1884, as I am now legally under the protection of my husband as recognized by Montana Territory law. Thomas wrote it down word for word. That's good. Clear language. Makes your status unambiguous. He looked up at Lillian. You expecting trouble from him? I'm expecting him to try everything he can think of to invalidate this marriage. She straightened in her chair. So I want everything documented thoroughly enough that no lawyer in Boston can find a loophole. Then we'll make this airtight. Thomas spent the next hour going through every possible legal angle, creating a paper trail that would have impressed any attorney. When he finally set down his pen, the documentation was complete and witnessed by Harold Benson and Martha Henderson, both of whom had come to the office specifically to add their names. There, Thomas said with satisfaction. That's as legally binding as anything gets out here. Your uncle can challenge until he's blue in the face, but Montana Territory recognizes this marriage, and that's what matters. Thank you. Lillian's relief was visible. I know this seems excessive, but it's not excessive when dealing with someone who's already proven they'll use any angle to control you, Martha interrupted. The boarding house owner had been quiet until now, but her expression was fierce. I've seen men like your uncle before. They think money and position put them above common decency. Good on you for standing up to him. I had help. Lillian glanced at Ethan, something soft in her expression. Still took courage. Martha stood, smoothing her apron. Now, as your wedding was somewhat rushed and lacking in proper celebration, I'm hosting a dinner tonight at the boarding house. Nothing fancy, just the folks who were here yesterday plus anyone else who wants to welcome you properly to our community. You don't have to do that, Lillian started. I want to. We take care of our own here, and you're one of ours now. Martha's tone brooked no argument. 6 o'clock, don't be late. She swept out before either of them could protest further. Thomas grinned. Martha's determined when she sets her mind to something. You'd best just accept the hospitality. Seems we don't have much choice, Ethan said, but he was smiling. They spent the rest of the afternoon in town, and Ethan watched as Lillian slowly transformed from the wary woman who'd arrived to someone more relaxed and open. People stopped to offer congratulations, to welcome her officially to Benton's Crossing, to share advice and stories about their own marriages. She handled it with grace that spoke to her Boston upbringing, but there was genuine warmth beneath the polish now. At the general store, Samuel Tucker's wife Susan pulled Lillian aside, and Ethan heard fragments of conversation about fabric and sewing and recipes. When Lillian emerged, she was holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's that?" he asked. Susan gave me some fabric, said every new bride needs something special. Lillian looked embarrassed and pleased all at once. I didn't know what to say. People here are so kind. That's frontier life. We depend on each other out here. Kindness isn't charity, it's survival. It's still overwhelming. You'll get used to it. The dinner at Martha's boarding house that evening was everything she'd promised. Nothing fancy but warm and welcoming. The main room had been rearranged to accommodate a long table, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. Thomas and his wife Sarah were there, along with Harold and his family, the Tuckers, and several other townspeople Ethan knew by name, if not by close friendship. They ate and talked, and gradually Ethan realized this wasn't just a celebration of his marriage. It was the town's way of claiming Lillian as one of their own, of sending a message that she was protected here. When people asked about her past, she gave simple answers. Came from Boston, circumstances were difficult, grateful for a fresh start. No one pushed for details they didn't need. After dinner, Sarah Whitmore pulled Lillian into conversation with several other women, and Ethan watched her relax further into genuine laughter at something Susan Tucker said. She looked happy. More than that, she looked free. "She's good for you," Thomas said, appearing at Ethan's elbow with 2 glasses of whiskey. "I've known you 8 years, and I've never seen you smile as much as you did today." "Didn't know I was that grim." "Not grim, just alone. There's a difference." Thomas handed him a glass. "To marriage and all its complications." "I'll drink to that." Ethan took a sip, the whiskey burning pleasantly. "Think her uncle will really give up?" "Hard to say. Men like that don't like losing, especially not to people they consider beneath them." Thomas's expression grew serious. "But he'd have to be stupid to try anything now. Half the town witnessed your marriage, and the other half heard about it. If he shows up again making trouble, he'll find himself facing a very unfriendly community." "Thanks for that, for organizing this." "Martha organized it. I just showed up." Thomas grinned. "But you're welcome. You've earned some goodwill around here, and it's about time you collected on it." The evening wore on, and gradually people began heading home. Ethan and Lillian were among the last to leave, stepping out into a cool night that promised more seasonal weather. The wagon ride back to the homestead was quiet, both of them tired but content. "That was nice," Lillian said as they rattled along the dark trail. "I've never been to anything like that before. In Boston, social gatherings were all about performance and status. Tonight felt real." "It was real. Those are good people." "I'm starting to understand why you chose this life. The isolation, the hard work, but also the community, the authenticity. There's something valuable in that." "There is." Ethan glanced at her. "You thinking you can tolerate it?" "I'm thinking I might actually thrive in it." She was quiet for a moment. "Ethan, I need to tell you something." The serious tone made him tense. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. It's just, today, watching everyone celebrate with us, making this marriage so public and documented, I realized something." She took a breath. "I would have said yes anyway, even without my uncle showing up, even without the threat forcing the timeline. If you'd asked me in 5 days like we'd planned, I would have said yes." His heart did something complicated in his chest. "Yeah?" "Yeah." She turned to face him as much as the wagon seat allowed. "I've been so focused on making sure I was choosing freely, on not being forced into anything, that I didn't let myself acknowledge what I already felt. But I do feel it, Ethan. Whatever this is between us, it's real for me. It's not gratitude or fear or desperation, it's..." She struggled for words. "It's you. The way you make me feel safe without making me feel weak. The way you're patient without being condescending. The way you see me as a person rather than a problem to solve or a prize to win." "Lillian, let me finish." Her voice was steady despite the emotion behind it. "I'm not saying I'm not scared. I am. Marriage is terrifying when your only model was your uncle's manipulation. But I want to try. I want to build something real with you, whatever that looks like. No more sleeping in separate rooms like we're strangers. No more treating this marriage like it's temporary or forced. I want it to be real." Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop, needing to see her face clearly in the moonlight. "You're sure?" "Because there's no rush, Lillian. We can keep taking this slow." "I'm sure." She reached for his hand, her grip firm and certain. "I'm choosing you, Ethan Cole. Not because circumstances forced me, but because you're worth choosing. You've been worth choosing since the moment you saw my bruised face and said I wasn't alone anymore." He kissed her then, properly this time, without an audience or fear or desperation making it urgent. Just 2 people acknowledging what they'd both known for a while but hadn't had the courage to say. When they pulled apart, Lillian was smiling. "So," she said, Can we agree this is a real marriage now? Not just a legal protection? It's real, Ethan confirmed. Has been for a while, at least for me. Just took you catching up. She laughed and hit his arm lightly. I caught up plenty fast, thank you. That you did. They rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, hands linked on the wagon seat, and Ethan felt something settle that he hadn't even known was unsettled. They were married, really married now, by choice rather than necessity. Whatever came next, they'd face together. The homestead looked welcoming in the moonlight, smoke from the banked fire drifting from the chimney. Ethan unhitched Bess and got her settled while Lillian went inside to stoke the fire. When he entered the cabin, she was standing by the bedroom door, clearly nervous but determined. I know this is probably awkward, she said, but I meant what I said. No more pretending this isn't real. Nothing has to happen tonight, Ethan said carefully. Real marriage doesn't mean rushing into anything you're not ready for. I know, and I appreciate that, but I'm tired of fear making my decisions for me. She moved toward him, and Ethan saw the courage it took her to close the distance between them. I want to share a bed with my husband. Just sleep for now. But together, like actual married people. If that's what you want. It is. She took his hand, leading him toward the bedroom. Come on. It's been a very long day, and I'd like to end it beside someone who makes me feel safe. They settled into the narrow bed with some awkwardness, neither quite sure where arms and legs should go, both hyper-aware of the other's presence in ways they hadn't been when sleeping separately. But gradually they found a position that worked, Lillian curled against Ethan's side, his arm around her shoulders. This okay? He asked quietly. This is perfect. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Ethan, for everything, for giving me space when I needed it and being patient when I was scared, for standing up to my uncle and making me feel like I was worth protecting, for choosing me even when I came with so many complications. You're not complicated. You're just human. He pressed a kiss to her hair. And for what it's worth, I'd choose you again. Every time. He felt her smile against his chest. Good. Because you're kind of stuck with me now. Could think of worse fates. They lay there in the darkness, listening to each other breathe, and Ethan thought about the strange path that had brought them to this moment. A desperate letter to a marriage agency. A woman fleeing abuse with nothing but courage and hope. A confrontation in a muddy yard that had forced decisions neither was quite ready for. And somehow, impossibly, it had all led here, to this bed, this woman in his arms, this feeling of rightness he'd never expected to find. The next weeks passed in a kind of golden haze. Winter's grip continued to loosen, and with the changing season came changes in their relationship. They learned each other's bodies gradually, carefully, with a patience born from knowing they had time. Lillian's fear of intimacy faded as she realized Ethan would never push, never take, never demand anything she wasn't ready to give. One morning in early March, Ethan woke to find Lillian already up, standing at the window with her hand pressed to her stomach and an expression he couldn't quite read. You all right? He asked, concern immediate. She turned to him and he saw tears on her cheeks. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them, massive and life-changing. Ethan sat up slowly, processing. You're sure? As sure as I can be without a doctor confirming it, but all the signs are there. She wrapped her arms around herself. I know we haven't talked about children. I know this is happening fast. He was across the room before she could finish, pulling her into his arms. This is good news, Lillian. The best news. You're not upset? Why would I be upset? We're married, we love each other, and now we're going to have a child. He pulled back to look at her face. That's everything I didn't know I wanted until I had you. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. I was so scared you'd think it was too soon, that we weren't ready. Maybe we're not ready. First-time parents rarely are. But we'll figure it out together, same as we've figured out everything else. He placed his hand gently over hers on her stomach. A baby. We're going to have a baby. We are. She covered his hand with her free one. Ethan, I'm terrified. What if I'm a terrible mother? What if I repeat the patterns I learned from my uncle? What if... You won't. You're nothing like him, Lillian. You've got more love and courage in your little finger than he had in his whole miserable existence. He kissed her forehead. And you're not doing this alone. We're partners, remember? We face everything together. She relaxed into him, the fear not gone, but manageable now. Together. I think I'm starting to really believe that. Good. Because it's true. They told Thomas and the others in town the next time they made the trip for supplies. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Susan Tucker began knitting blankets. Martha Henderson offered advice from raising her own 4 children. Sarah Whitmore promised to be there when the time came to help with the birth. This is what community means, Lillian said on the ride home, her arms full of gifts and advice from the townspeople. People caring about each other's joys and struggles. I never had this in Boston. You have it now. I do. She looked at him with such complete trust that Ethan felt the weight of it settle around his shoulders. We both do. Spring arrived in earnest, and with it came the hard work of planting and preparation. Lillian couldn't do the heavy labor anymore, but she insisted on helping where she could, planning the garden, organizing supplies, cooking meals that were now consistently good rather than occasionally edible. She transformed from the bruised woman who'd arrived in September to someone confident and capable, her body rounding with pregnancy, her face glowing with health and happiness. One evening in late April, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Lillian turned to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever regret it? Writing to that agency? The way everything turned out so differently than you planned? Ethan thought about the question seriously, looking back at the lonely man he'd been less than a year ago. No. I regret that you had to suffer to get here. I regret that your uncle was such a bastard that running to a stranger was your best option. But the outcome? Having you here, building this life together, about to become parents? He shook his head. No regrets about that at all. Good. She leaned against him, his arm coming around her shoulders automatically. Because I don't have any either. Even the hard parts, the scary parts. They led here. And here's exactly where I want to be. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the Montana sky filling with stars, and Ethan reflected on how much had changed in 8 months. He'd asked for a mail-order bride and gotten a woman who'd needed rescue, but she'd rescued him too, in ways he was still discovering. She'd taken his empty cabin and filled it with laughter and warmth. She'd transformed his solitary existence into partnership. She'd given him purpose beyond mere survival. And now they were going to be parents. They were building not just a marriage, but a family, creating something lasting from the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. It wasn't the story he'd imagined when he'd written that letter. It was better. Summer came to Montana with a vengeance, the kind of heat that made everything shimmer and turned the prairie grass golden. Lillian was 6 months pregnant now, moving with the careful deliberation of someone carrying precious cargo. Ethan watched her constantly, torn between admiration for her strength and worry about everything that could go wrong so far from proper medical care. Stop hovering, she told him one afternoon, catching him watching her hang laundry for the 3rd time in an hour. I'm pregnant, not made of glass. I know. I know. Her expression softened. But I'm fine, Ethan. Strong as a horse, according to Sarah when she checked on me last week. The baby's healthy, I'm healthy, everything's exactly as it should be. Doesn't stop me worrying. I'd be more concerned if you didn't worry. She moved to him, taking his hand and placing it on her rounded belly. Feel that? Your daughter saying hello. The movement under his palm never failed to amaze him, proof of life they'd created together, growing stronger every day. How do you know it's a girl? I just know. Lillian smiled with the kind of certainty that came from somewhere beyond logic. She's going to be fierce and brave and absolutely refuse to let anyone tell her she can't do something, just like her mother learned to be. And just like her father taught her mother she could be. That too. She kissed his cheek. Now stop worrying and help me finish this laundry. The sooner we're done, the sooner we can sit in the shade and you can read to me. I finished that book last night and I'm dying to know what happens next. They'd settled into rhythms that felt like they'd existed forever, rather than less than a year. Mornings, Ethan worked the land while Lillian managed the house and garden. Afternoons, they'd often work together on whatever needed doing, finding ways she could contribute without overtaxing herself. Evenings were for reading and talking and simply being together, watching her belly grow and planning for a future that felt simultaneously terrifying and perfect. But the peace they'd built was shattered in mid-July by a letter that arrived with the weekly mail Thomas brought out from town. Ethan recognized the expensive paper and formal seal before Lillian even opened it. Legal correspondence from Boston. He watched her face go pale as she read, her hand trembling slightly. "He's challenging the marriage," she said quietly. "My uncle. He's filed a petition in Boston claiming I was mentally incompetent when I consented, that the marriage was performed under duress and without proper legal authority. He's demanding the territorial governor investigate and annul the marriage on grounds of fraud." "Let me see that." Ethan took the letter, scanning the legal language with growing anger. Richard Moore had apparently spent the past 5 months building a case, collecting testimonies from Boston physicians who'd never examined Lillian, affidavits from people who claimed she'd been unstable and easily manipulated. It was all lies, but it was presented with enough official polish to seem credible. "He can't actually do this, can he?" Lillian's voice was small, afraid in a way Ethan hadn't heard since those first days. "We followed the law. Thomas performed the ceremony legally. Everything was documented. He can try." Ethan kept reading, his jaw tightening. "Says here he's demanding you return to Boston for psychiatric evaluation to determine your fitness to have consented to marriage. Claims that as a concerned guardian, he has the right to ensure your well-being. He's not my guardian anymore. The marriage ended that. Which is exactly why he wants the marriage annulled, so he can reclaim guardianship and control of your inheritance." Ethan set down the letter. "This is about money, not concern. He's running out of time to access your inheritance before you turn 25, so he's trying one last legal maneuver." "What do we do?" Lillian's hand went to her belly protectively. "I can't go back there, Ethan. I won't. Especially not now, not pregnant. If he gets me back to Boston, if he can force me into some asylum on false testimony, that's not going to happen." Ethan pulled her into his arms, feeling her shake against him. "We fight this. We get our own legal representation. We document everything. We make it impossible for him to claim you were incompetent or coerced." "How?" "He has resources we don't have, lawyers, money, connections in Boston." "But we have the truth. And we have people here who'll testify to exactly what they witnessed." He pulled back to look at her face. "Every person at our wedding, everyone in town who's seen how you've thrived here, how you've built a life. That's evidence no Boston lawyer can dispute. You're not the broken woman he tried to make you. You're strong and capable and very clearly of sound mind." "Will that be enough?" "It has to be." But even as he said it, Ethan felt the cold weight of uncertainty. The law wasn't always just, and men with money and influence could bend it to their purposes. Richard Moore had already proven he was willing to lie, manipulate, and use any tool available to get what he wanted. They rode to town the next morning, the letter clutched in Lillian's hand like evidence of a crime. Thomas read it carefully in his office, his expression growing grimmer with each paragraph. "This is serious," he said finally. "Moore's filed this with the territorial governor's office in Helena. They're obligated to investigate any claim of improper marriage procedures, especially ones involving allegations of mental incompetence." "But you know that's nonsense," Lillian said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "You've known me for months now. Have I ever shown any sign of being mentally incompetent?" "Not even remotely. You're one of the most clear-headed women I've met." Thomas set down the letter. "But here's the problem. The burden of proof isn't on him to show you were incompetent. It's on us to prove you weren't. And he's got testimonies from doctors, character witnesses, people claiming to have known you in Boston. People he's paying to lie. Probably, but proving that is another matter entirely." Thomas leaned back in his chair, thinking. "What we need is our own documentation. Medical testimony that you're of sound mind, statements from everyone who witnessed the marriage and can attest to you entering it freely, evidence that you've been functioning perfectly well as a married woman these past months." "I can do that," Sarah Whitmore said from the doorway. She'd arrived while they were talking, summoned by Thomas's son who'd been sent running. "I've been checking on Lillian regularly for the pregnancy. I can testify not only to her physical health, but to her mental state. She's coherent, rational, makes good decisions about her own care, all evidence of competence." That helps, Thomas said. We'll also need statements from everyone at the wedding. Martha, Harold, the others who saw you consent freely without coercion. And I can write to the Boston Marriage Agency, Lillian added, her mind clearly working through possibilities. They have records of my correspondence, proof that I initiated the arrangement myself before my uncle even knew I'd fled. That shows premeditation and rational planning, not the actions of someone mentally incompetent. Good thinking. Thomas started making notes. We'll compile everything, send it to the governor's office with our own petition. Meanwhile, I'll write to a lawyer friend in Helena, someone who understands territorial law and can represent you if this goes to any kind of hearing. How long will this take? Ethan asked, already calculating how close they were cutting it to Lillian's due date. Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be months. The territorial government isn't exactly speedy. Thomas looked at Lillian with sympathy. I know this is frightening, but try not to let it consume you. Stress isn't good for the baby, and from everything I've seen, you've got a strong case. Over the following weeks, they built their defense. Sarah wrote a detailed medical assessment of Lillian's mental and physical health. Martha provided a statement about how competent and capable Lillian had been in all their interactions. Harold testified to witnessing a woman making a clear, uncoerced choice. Even Samuel Tucker and his wife contributed observations about Lillian's rational behavior and sound judgment in managing household affairs. The Boston Marriage Agency responded to Lillian's letter with not just records but a scathing statement about Richard Moore's attempts to interfere with their client's legal arrangements. Mrs. Hensworth, who'd written the original warning letter, included documentation of Lillian's correspondence showing clear, rational planning and decision-making. This is actually quite compelling, Thomas said, reviewing the collected materials. We've got medical testimony, multiple witness statements, contemporaneous records from the agency, and the obvious evidence that you've been functioning perfectly well. Any reasonable investigation should conclude you were fully competent when you married. But will the investigation be reasonable? Lillian asked. My uncle has influence. In Boston, less so in Montana Territory. Thomas's smile was grim. Out here, we judge people by what they do, not by how much money their relatives have. The territorial governor will see that in these statements. They sent the compiled documentation to Helena in early August, and then there was nothing to do but wait. The waiting was torture. Every day Lillian watched for riders who might be coming with news, good or bad. Every night she woke with anxiety that transferred to restless movements that kept Ethan awake too. I can't stop thinking about it, she admitted one sleepless night in mid-August, her hand on her belly where their daughter was doing acrobatics. What if they rule against us? What if they decide the marriage is invalid and I have to— They won't. Ethan pulled her closer, wishing he felt as confident as he sounded. We've got truth and evidence on our side. That has to count for something. Does it? Or does money and influence count for more? She was crying now, quiet tears soaking into his shirt. I'm so tired of being afraid, Ethan. I thought I was done with fear when I married you, but it's back and it's worse because now I have so much more to lose. You, the baby, this life we've built. If he takes that away. He won't take anything away. I won't let him. Ethan knew it was an empty promise. He couldn't control what happened in Helena or how the territorial government decided, but he made it anyway because she needed to hear it. Whatever happens, we face it together. Even if we have to run, even if we have to start over somewhere else, even if we have to fight this for years, we do it together. You'd do that? Run with me if we had to? I'd follow you anywhere. He meant it completely. This homestead, this land, it's just property. You're my home now, you and our daughter. Wherever you are, that's where I belong. She cried harder, but they were different tears now, relief and love mixed with the fear. I love you so much it terrifies me. I know the feeling. He pressed a kiss to her hair. Try to sleep. Whatever tomorrow brings, we'll handle it. The response from Helena came in early September, almost exactly a year since Lillian had first stepped off that stagecoach. Thomas rode out personally to deliver it, his face revealing nothing as he handed Ethan the official envelope. Lillian stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her belly. She was 8 months pregnant now, so close to her due date that they'd all stopped traveling to town, and watched with barely contained anxiety as Ethan opened the letter. He read it once, quickly, then again more slowly to make sure he understood correctly. Then he looked up at Lillian with a smile that made his face ache. They ruled in our favor. The marriage stands. The territorial governor found no evidence of mental incompetence or coercion, and furthermore noted that all proper legal procedures were followed. Richard Moore's petition is denied. Lillian's knees buckled, and Ethan was there immediately, catching her, holding her as she sobbed with relief. Thomas waited patiently, smiling at the scene before him. "There's more," Thomas said when Lillian had calmed enough to listen. The governor's office sent a formal letter to Richard Moore informing him that any further attempts to interfere with Mrs. Lillian Cole's legal marriage would be considered harassment and dealt with accordingly. They also forwarded all the evidence we provided to a judge in Boston who apparently had questions about Moore's guardianship practices. Something about suspicious financial transactions involving his ward's inheritance. "What does that mean?" Lillian asked, wiping at her face. "It means your uncle's about to face some very uncomfortable questions about how he managed your money while you were under his guardianship." Thomas's smile was satisfied. "Seems the detailed timeline you provided, showing when the abuse escalated and correlating it with his financial difficulties, raised some red flags. There's going to be an audit. He'll be investigated?" Hope crept into Lillian's voice. "Thoroughly. And if they find what I suspect they'll find, evidence that he was stealing from your inheritance to cover his own debts, he'll face criminal charges." Thomas handed Ethan another document. "This is a restraining order issued by the territorial governor. Richard Moore is forbidden from contacting you, coming to Montana territory, or making any further claims on your person or property. If he violates it, he'll be arrested on sight." "It's over." Lillian said it like she couldn't quite believe it. "It's actually over." "It's over," Ethan confirmed, pulling her close. "You're free, Lillian, really free. Not just because you ran, but because the law actually sided with you for once." She cried then in earnest, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body and probably weren't good for the baby but were absolutely necessary for her soul. Ethan held her through it, and Thomas waited patiently, understanding that some tears needed to be shed. When she finally calmed, Lillian looked up at Thomas with red-rimmed eyes. "Thank you. For everything. For believing me, for helping us fight this, for doing what's right," Thomas interrupted gently. "No thanks needed for that. You're part of our community now, Lillian. We protect our own." He left them alone after that, riding back to town with promises to share the good news with everyone who'd helped build their case. Ethan and Lillian stood in the yard, holding each other as the September sun climbed higher and let the reality of their victory sink in. "I keep waiting to feel relieved," Lillian said after a long silence, "but all I feel is exhausted." "That's normal. You've been carrying this fear for months. It'll take time for your body to believe it's really over. Will you remind me? When I wake up afraid? When I start imagining him showing up again?" She looked at him with such trust that Ethan felt the weight of it settle in his chest. "Will you remind me that I'm safe now? Every day for the rest of our lives, if that's what you need." "Good." She managed a smile. "Because I have a feeling our daughter is going to arrive any day now, and I'd really like to welcome her into a world where I'm not terrified all the time." She was right about the timing. 3 days later, on a cool September morning that reminded Ethan painfully of the day they'd met, Lillian's water broke. The next hours were a blur of activity, getting her comfortable, sending for Sarah Whitmore, preparing everything they'd set aside for this moment. Lillian labored through the day and into the evening, gripping Ethan's hand hard enough to leave bruises while Sarah offered encouragement and guidance. "You're doing so well," Sarah said for probably the 100th time. "Not much longer now." "You said that 2 hours ago," Lillian gasped between contractions. "And I was right. It wasn't much longer. Now it's even less longer." Sarah's humor broke through Lillian's pain enough to make her laugh, which immediately turned into a groan as another contraction hit. Ethan felt utterly useless, able to do nothing but hold her hand and watch her suffer through something he couldn't fix or ease. "I'm sorry," he said at one point. "I'm so sorry." "For what?" Lillian panted. "For this. For putting you through this." "You idiot!" She gripped his hand harder. "You gave me this. A baby. A family. A reason to fight my way free.
Don't you dare apologize for the best thing that's ever happened to me." "She's right," Sarah said, checking Lillian's progress. "And speaking of best things, you're about to meet your daughter. Next contraction, I need you to push."
The final stage of labor was brutal and terrifying and over faster than Ethan expected. One moment, Lillian was pushing with strength he didn't know she had, and the next Sarah was lifting a squalling, red-faced infant into the evening light. "A girl," Sarah announced, though they'd all known somehow. "A beautiful, healthy girl." She cleaned the baby quickly and laid her on Lillian's chest, and Ethan watched his wife's face transform with wonder and exhaustion and love so fierce it made his chest ache. "Hello, little one," Lillian whispered, touching the baby's dark hair with shaking fingers. "Welcome to the world. We've been waiting for you." The baby stopped crying at her mother's voice, blinking up with unfocused eyes that would probably turn the same deep brown as Lillian's. She was perfect, tiny and furious, and absolutely perfect. "What are you going to name her?" Sarah asked, finishing her work and giving them space. Ethan and Lillian looked at each other. They discussed names but never settled on one, both wanting to meet their daughter first to see what fit. "Clara," Lillian said softly. "After the maid who helped me escape. Clara Hope Cole, because she represents the hope I found when I ran toward an unknown future." "Clara Hope," Ethan repeated, testing how it sounded. "That's perfect." "She's perfect." Lillian's eyes were full of tears again, but happy ones this time. "Look what we made, Ethan. Look what came from all that fear and pain and struggling. She's proof that something beautiful can grow from terrible circumstances. She's proof that you're stronger than anything that tried to break you." He kissed Lillian's forehead, then dared to touch his daughter's tiny fist with one finger. She grabbed it immediately, her grip surprisingly strong. "She's got your determination already. And your stubbornness. I prefer to call it persistence." They laughed quietly, exhausted and overwhelmed and happier than either had imagined possible a year ago. Sarah finished cleaning up and preparing to leave, promising to check on them tomorrow and bring supplies from town. "You did beautifully," she told Lillian. "Both mother and baby are healthy and strong. Get some rest now, you've earned it." After Sarah left, Ethan and Lillian lay together in the bed that had become theirs, their daughter sleeping between them, and marveled at how dramatically life could change in such a short time. "A year ago today," Lillian said quietly, "I stepped off that stagecoach terrified and broken, not knowing if I'd survive the choice I'd made. And now you're lying here with our daughter, free and safe and whole. Because of you." She looked at him over Clara's sleeping form. "Because you saw someone who needed help and decided to be the kind of man who helps. Because you were patient when I was afraid and strong when I was weak. Because you loved me even when I didn't think I deserved to be loved. You always deserved it. You just needed time to believe it. I believe it now." She reached across their daughter to take his hand. "I believe in you, in us, in this family we've built. I believe that terrible things can lead to beautiful outcomes if we're brave enough to keep choosing hope." Clara made a small sound in her sleep, and they both froze, waiting to see if she'd wake. When she settled again, Ethan felt something shift in his chest. The final piece of a puzzle he hadn't known was incomplete clicking into place. This was his family, this woman who'd arrived broken and rebuilt herself into someone magnificent. This tiny person they'd created who represented everything good that could come from choosing love over fear. This life they'd built together from desperate circumstances and stubborn hope. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For running toward me instead of away. For taking a chance on a stranger in the wilderness. For being brave enough to believe you deserved better than what you'd been given. For choosing me, even when circumstances tried to make it anything but a choice. Thank you for being worth choosing." Lillian's smile was soft in the lamplight. "For being the kind of man a desperate woman could trust when trust seemed impossible. For proving that not all men are like my uncle. For showing me what love actually looks like when it's real." They lay in comfortable silence, watching their daughter sleep, both thinking about the improbable journey that had brought them here. From a mail-order bride arrangement born of loneliness and desperation to this, a real marriage built on respect and patience and genuine love. From a woman fleeing violence to a mother cradling her newborn. From a man living in self-imposed isolation to a father ready to build something lasting. The weeks after Clara's birth passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles. Ethan learned to change diapers and soothe crying and function on minimal sleep. Lillian navigated the challenges of nursing and healing and adjusting to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything. Together they stumbled through those early days of parenthood, making mistakes and learning from them, too tired to do anything but laugh when things went wrong. The town rallied around them, as frontier communities did. Martha brought meals for the first week. Susan Tucker provided clothes her own children had outgrown. Sarah checked on them regularly, offering advice and reassurance. Thomas stopped by with news from Helena. Richard Moore had indeed been charged with embezzlement and fraud, his investigation revealing years of stealing from Lillian's inheritance. He'd likely spend considerable time in prison, his reputation destroyed and his influence gone. "So it really is over," Lillian said when Thomas shared the news. Clara was nursing, and Lillian looked down at her daughter with wonder. "He can't hurt us anymore." "He can't hurt anyone anymore," Thomas confirmed. "And your inheritance, what's left of it after his theft, will be released to you when you turn 25. It's not the full amount your parents left, but it's substantial." "I don't care about the money," Lillian stroked Clara's dark hair. "I have everything I need right here." Winter came again, Clara's first. The cabin that had once felt empty now seemed almost too small for their growing family, filled with baby sounds and the constant activity of keeping a newborn alive and healthy. They planned expansions, another room for Clara, maybe more rooms for future children if they were blessed with them. "Future children," Ethan said one evening as they sat by the fire, Clara asleep in the cradle he'd built. "You're already thinking about more?" "Eventually." Lillian smiled at him. "This one was somewhat unexpected timing, but I'd like to give her siblings when we're ready. I always wanted a big family, before my uncle, before everything. I'd like to reclaim that dream." "Then we'll reclaim it together." He pulled her close, marveling at how natural this all felt now. "However many children you want, whenever you want them." "What about what you want?" "I want you happy. Everything else is negotiable." As winter deepened and the year turned, they settled into the rhythm of family life. Clara grew from a tiny newborn into a baby with personality, demanding and curious and already showing signs of her mother's stubbornness and her father's quiet strength. The homestead that had been built for solitude transformed into something warm and alive, filled with laughter and crying and all the messy reality of raising a child. On a cold February evening, almost exactly a year after their hasty wedding in the yard, Ethan and Lillian stood together at the window, watching snow fall while Clara slept peacefully in her cradle. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Lillian asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "If I hadn't run, if I'd stayed in Boston, you'd probably be dead." Ethan said it bluntly because it was true. "Your uncle and his business partner would have made sure of it. And you'd still be alone out here, living in silence. Not living, existing." He turned to face her. "You gave me a life, Lillian, a real life with meaning and purpose and love. Before you, I was just going through motions, filling days until there were no more days to fill. Now I have reasons to wake up, reasons to build something lasting, reasons to believe tomorrow might be better than today. We gave each other life." She touched his face gently. "You saved me from my uncle, but I think I saved you from yourself, from loneliness and isolation and the kind of slow death that comes from cutting yourself off from human connection. Maybe we saved each other." "Definitely we saved each other." She kissed him softly. "Happy anniversary, Ethan Cole. Thank you for being my husband, my partner, my home." "Happy anniversary, Lillian Cole. Thank you for choosing me, even when you had every reason not to." They stood there in the quiet cabin, their daughter sleeping nearby, the snow falling outside, and understood that they'd created something rare and precious. Not a perfect life. There would always be challenges and struggles and moments of doubt, but a real one, a chosen one. A life built on the foundation of two broken people who'd found each other at exactly the right moment and decided to build something beautiful from the wreckage. The mail-order bride with bruises and fear in her eyes was gone. replaced by a woman who stood tall and confident, who loved fiercely and lived fully. The lonely cowboy who'd built walls around his heart had learned to let someone in, had discovered that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but strength. Together, they'd proved that love wasn't about perfect circumstances or ideal timing. It was about choice. Choosing each other day after day, choosing hope over fear, choosing to build rather than retreat. It was about seeing someone's worst moments and believing in their best. It was about patience and persistence and the stubborn refusal to give up on something worth fighting for. Years would pass. Clara would grow, joined eventually by siblings, a brother named William after Lillian's father, then twin girls they named Sarah and Catherine after the women who'd helped them most. The homestead would expand, the isolated cabin becoming a proper home surrounded by land worked by their own hands and filled with children's laughter. Lillian would thrive in ways she'd never imagined possible, becoming a pillar of their small community, teaching other women that survival was possible, that escape was achievable, that broken didn't mean destroyed. She'd write letters to the Boston Marriage Agency, thanking them for the chance they'd given her and encouraging them to continue helping women who needed an escape route to safety. Ethan would discover that partnership made everything better, the work lighter, the challenges more manageable, the joys multiplied by having someone to share them with. He'd watch his wife blossom and his children grow and understand that writing that desperate letter to a marriage agency had been the smartest thing he'd ever done. But all of that was future. For now, on this February evening, they were just two people who'd found each other against impossible odds, standing in their modest home, grateful for the life they'd built from desperation and hope. The woman who'd arrived bruised and terrified now stood confident and loved, proof that transformation was possible with patience and support. The man who'd lived in isolation now had a family, proof that walls could come down when the right person made it safe to be vulnerable. Together they'd turned a mail-order arrangement born of desperation into something neither had dared dream of, a real marriage built on choice and respect and love that deepened with every passing day. The note that had come with Lillian that first day had said she wasn't alone anymore. Ethan had promised her safety. But what they'd built was so much more than that. They'd built a home, a family, a future. They'd built proof that terrible circumstances could lead to beautiful outcomes. They'd built a love story that started with fear and ended with hope triumphant. And as they stood together watching snow fall on their Montana homestead, their daughter sleeping peacefully nearby, they understood that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the person you need finds you exactly when you need them. Sometimes running toward the unknown is braver than staying with the familiar. Sometimes a desperate woman and a lonely cowboy can build something lasting from nothing but courage and stubborn hope. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to change everything.